Hi friends, I hope you're all happy and healthy. I included some of your lovely comments in this video. They made me so happy. I really need your support to reach 1,000 likes and 1,000 comments. If everyone who watches likes and comments, we can do it together. And if you're not part of our family yet, please subscribe. Thank you. Let's jump in now. Most people think a park ranger's job is checking permits and giving directions to scenic overlooks. They don't know about the reports we file in duplicate, one for the public record, another for the locked cabinet in the superintendent's office. They don't know why certain grid coordinates never appear on our search maps, or why we carry extra batteries for equipment that shouldn't drain so quickly in these particular valleys. My name is David and I've been a ranger at Cascade National Forest for 12 years. What I'm about to tell you violates several federal regulations and probably my oath of service. But after what happened to James and the others, staying silent isn't an option anymore. The old-timers call it the Guardian Protocol. It's not in any manual. The missing hiker call came in at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. Sarah Chen, 26, hadn't returned from what should have been a day hike on the Whispering Pines Trail. Her car was still in the parking lot, registration expired, Maryland plates, probably got turned around, said Ranger Williams over the radio. Trails well marked, but city folks get confused when the sun goes down. I'd heard Williams say that exact phrase 47 times in the past 5 years. Word for word, same inflection, like he was reading from a script. By dawn, we had 12 searchers spread across the primary grid. Standard protocol. The Whispering Pines Trail runs 4.2 miles through mixed forest, elevation gain of 800 feet, clearly marked every quarter mile. You'd have to work hard to get lost. We found her backpack at mile marker 2.3, 20 feet off the trail in a cluster of old-growth fir. Contents scattered like she'd dropped it while running. Wallet intact. Emergency whistle unused. GPS unit displaying coordinates that didn't correspond to any location in the park. The readout showed she was 847 feet underground. Equipment malfunction, Williams noted in his incident report. But I'd checked the GPS unit against my own. Both showed the same impossible coordinates. At mile marker 3.1, we found her left hiking boot. At 3.9, her water bottle, still half full. The trail ended at a scenic overlook with a 200-foot drop to the valley floor. No signs of Sarah Chen. That night, Williams took me aside after the briefing. David, you've been here long enough to understand that some cases require different handling procedures. Different how? Sarah Chen was reported as a voluntary disappearance. Her family will be told she left behind no forwarding address. Her car will be impounded and eventually auctioned. This conversation never happened, but we haven't found anything actionable. Case closed. I filed my official report as instructed. But I kept a copy of everything. The GPS readings, the boot print measurements, the photos of the scattered belongings. That night I called my grandfather. Joseph Running Bear had worked these forests for 30 years before retirement. Klamath tribe, third-generation forester, the kind of man who could tell you what animal had passed by from a broken twig 3 days old. He'd trained half the current ranger staff, including Williams. Grandpa, we had a disappearance today. Something's not right about how it's being handled. Long silence. Then, what did you find? I described the scene, the scattered belongings, the impossible GPS readings, Williams' instructions. Another silence, longer this time. David, there are things in these woods that don't fit in official reports. Your grandmother's people, the Coast Salish, they have words for what walks between the trees. Seske, the guardians. Guardians of what? Of balance. Of the old agreements. Some hikers take more than they should. Some bring disrespect. The forest has ways of teaching. Grandpa, this is the 21st century. We're talking about a missing person, not tribal legends. Are we? Then explain the GPS coordinates. Explain why her belongings were arranged in a perfect triangle 60 feet apart. Explain why you found tracks that don't match any known animal. I hadn't mentioned the tracks to anyone. 3-toed prints, 18 inches long, pressed deep into earth that should have been too hard to take impressions. I'd photographed them before Williams arrived and told me to focus on relevant evidence. How did you know about the tracks? Because I've seen them before, 47 times in 30 years. Always the same pattern, always the same aftermath. City people who thought the forest owed them something. What happened to them? Some were returned, some weren't. Depends on whether they learned respect before it was too late. That night, I drove back to the Whispering Pines trailhead. Park regulations prohibited after-hours access. but I had a master key and 48 hours before the area would be officially reopened to public use. The forest felt different in darkness. Sounds carried wrong. My footsteps echoing when they should have been muffled by fallen leaves. Silence where there should have been night birds. My radio crackled with static every few minutes. Garbled transmissions that sounded like voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. At mile marker 2.3, where we'd found Sarah's backpack, I discovered something we'd missed during the daytime search. 3 small stacks of river stones, each exactly 7 stones high, arranged around the spot where her belongings had been scattered. The stones weren't from this area. They were smooth river rock, the kind you'd find 15 miles downstream in the valley. My flashlight batteries died simultaneously at mile marker 3.1, where we'd found her boot. I had spare batteries, but they drained within minutes. Emergency backup batteries lasted even less time. Whatever was affecting electronic equipment was getting stronger as I moved deeper into the search area. I continued by moonlight, following the trail by memory and instinct. At mile marker 3.9, where we'd found the water bottle, I heard it for the first time, singing. Low, rhythmic, like a work song or prayer. Too low for a human voice, but too structured for wind or animal sounds. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding me without direction or source. I followed the sound off-trail, into the old growth section where the trees grew so thick that moonlight couldn't penetrate. The singing grew louder, more distinct. Multiple voices now, harmonizing in that same unknown language I'd heard on the radio static. After what felt like hours of walking through absolute darkness, I emerged into a circular clearing I'd never seen before. In the center stood a structure I couldn't immediately identify. Smooth poles arranged in a spiral pattern, rising 12 feet high, with objects hanging from crosspieces between them. As my eyes adjusted, I realized what I was looking at. A cache. A traditional Native American food storage structure, the kind my grandfather had described from his childhood. But this one was different. Wrong. The objects hanging from the crosspieces weren't dried fish or preserved meat. They were personal belongings. Backpacks, clothing, cameras, cell phones. Dozens of items, all showing signs of weather exposure. Some looked fresh, others had been there for years. At the base of the structure, arranged in a perfect circle, were hiking boots. Different sizes, different brands, different levels of wear. I counted 34 pairs. Sarah Chen's right boot was the newest addition. I found her 20 feet away, sitting cross-legged against an enormous cedar tree, eyes closed, breathing slow and steady. Alive, but unresponsive. Her bare feet were dirty but uninjured. Her clothes were arranged neatly, as if she'd deliberately chosen to wait in this exact spot. "Sarah?" I whispered. Her eyes opened immediately, but she didn't look at me. She was staring at something behind me. I turned around, 8 feet away, partially concealed by shadow and bracken. Something was watching us. Not human, but not entirely animal either. Tall, perhaps 7 feet, covered in dark, coarse hair. Its face was a mixture of human and ape features. Intelligent eyes that reflected moonlight like a nocturnal predator's. It made no aggressive moves, didn't approach, just watched, as if waiting for something. "Sarah, we need to leave. Can you walk?" She nodded but didn't move. "He says I took something that wasn't mine." "Who says?" "The guardian." I carved my initials in the old tree, the one by the waterfall. "He says that tree is older than my people's memory, and I marked it like I owned it." I looked back at the creature. It hadn't moved, but somehow seemed closer. What does he want? Acknowledgement, respect, understanding that the forest doesn't belong to us. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my knife, not as a weapon, but as an offering. My grandfather had given it to me when I started ranger training. A traditional design, bone handle, steel blade worn smooth by decades of use. I placed it on the ground between myself and the guardian, then backed away. The creature approached slowly, deliberately. It examined the knife without touching it, then looked directly at me. When it spoke, the voice was like wind through deep canyons, barely recognizable as language. "You understand the old ways." I nodded. "My grandfather taught me respect for the forest and its guardians." "Your grandfather was wise. He knew when to look away from certain disappearances. He knew when people needed teaching and when they needed returning." "What about Sarah?" The guardian looked at her with something approaching gentleness. "She will remember that the forest is not decoration for human convenience. She will remember that some places are sacred and some marks cannot be carved without consequence." Sarah blinked as if waking from a dream. She looked around the clearing with confusion, then at me with recognition. "Ranger, how did I get here?" I was on the trail and then, I don't remember. The guardian stepped back into shadow and vanished. Not gradually, simply gone as if he'd never been there at all. Sarah had no memory of the previous 18 hours. During our walk back to the trailhead, she mentioned feeling different about nature, more aware of her place in it. She couldn't explain why, but she knew she'd never again think of the forest as merely a hiking destination. I filed a standard report. Hiker found disoriented but unharmed, minor exposure, released to family care. No mention of the clearing, the cache, or what I'd encountered there. But I kept the photos I'd taken of the boot collection. 34 pairs. 34 missing hikers over the years, going back decades. Some I recognized from cold case files we weren't supposed to access. Williams never asked about my unauthorized night search. The next morning, he just nodded when I told him Sarah had been found and was being returned to her family. Good work, David. Some cases resolve themselves when people learn what they need to learn. That's when I realized Williams had always known about the Guardian. The entire ranger station knew. We were never really searching for missing hikers. We were giving them time to receive their education, then collecting them when the lessons were complete. The Guardian protocol wasn't about covering up disappearances. It was about managing a teaching system that had existed longer than the Park Service, longer than European settlement, longer than recorded history. 3 weeks after the Sarah Chen incident, I was assigned to train a new ranger, James Martinez, fresh from the academy, full of enthusiasm and federal procedures. Clean uniform, new equipment, regulation everything. The kind of ranger who would follow protocol to the letter and expect results that matched the textbook. The Cascade Forest covers 127,000 acres, I explained during his first orientation. We have 14 marked trails, 6 backcountry camping areas, and an average of 50,000 visitors per year. Our primary responsibilities are visitor safety, wildlife protection, and resource conservation. James took notes on everything. What's our missing person statistics? Officially, we have one of the lowest missing person rates in the National Forest System. Less than 1% of visitors report incidents requiring search and rescue operations. And unofficially, I studied his face. Earnest, curious but not skeptical, maybe trainable. Unofficially, some people who enter these woods need time to learn lessons that can't be taught in parking lots or visitor centers. I don't understand. You will. The call came in 2 days later. Robert Chen, no relation to Sarah, had failed to return from a solo camping trip in the North Valley area. His permit was for 3 days. He'd been gone for 5. His emergency contact was his employer, a logging company with contracts in 3 western states. Robert Chen, 34, Portland address but works out of multiple locations. Williams briefed us. Experienced outdoorsman, extensive camping gear, no known medical conditions. Last seen at the North Valley trailhead Sunday morning. James raised his hand. What's the protocol for extended search operations? Standard grid search first, Williams replied. If that doesn't produce results, we move to special circumstances procedures. Special circumstances? Williams looked at me. I could see the calculation in his eyes. Was James ready for the truth, or did he need more preparation? Some searches require cultural sensitivity training, I said. The North Valley area has particular significance to local tribal communities. If Mr. Chen has encountered traditional education protocols, we need to respect the process. James looked confused, but he followed my lead to the North Valley trailhead. The area was different from Whispering Pines. Older trees, deeper shadows, less defined trail markers. The kind of place where GPS units malfunctioned and cell phones couldn't find signals. We found Robert's truck at the parking area, fully loaded with high-end camping equipment. Receipts on the dashboard showed he'd spent over $3,000 on gear in the past month. Military surplus tent, professional-grade boots, enough emergency food for 2 weeks. Everything chosen for maximum impact on the environment rather than minimum footprint. Guys prepared for war, James commented. Or conquest, I muttered. The trail into North Valley followed an old logging road for the first 2 miles, then branched into single track through dense forest. Robert's permit indicated he'd planned a camp at Devil's Bowl, a natural amphitheater where a seasonal creek formed a series of pools. We found his first campsite at mile marker 1.5, but it wasn't where his permit said he'd planned to stop. The site was in a meadow traditionally used by tribal hunting parties, marked with subtle stone cairns that indicated sacred space. Robert had set up his military surplus tent directly over one of the cairns, crushing it flat. This isn't his designated camping area, James observed. No, but it's a power move. Establishing dominance over the landscape, the campsite showed signs of extensive impact. Robert had built an unnecessary fire ring using stones from a nearby creek, cutting live branches for firewood instead of using fallen deadfall. He'd carved his initials deep into a century-old pine tree and left trash scattered around the area as if marking territory. He's not following leave no trace principles, James said. He's actively violating them. This is the camping equivalent of tagging a cathedral with spray paint. We followed his trail deeper into the valley. At each subsequent campsite, the environmental damage increased. Trees carved with messages, fire rings built from ancient rock formations, trash deliberately scattered rather than accidentally dropped. Robert Chen was systematically desecrating every sacred space he encountered. At mile marker 4.2, we found his equipment cache. Backpack, sleeping bag, cooking gear, all arranged neatly at the base of a massive cedar tree. No signs of struggle, no indication of emergency abandonment. The gear had been placed there deliberately, as if Robert had decided he no longer needed it. This doesn't make sense, James said. Why would he abandon his gear in perfect condition? Maybe he learned he didn't need it anymore? James gave me a sharp look. David, there's something you're not telling me about these searches. I checked my watch. 3:15 p.m., which gave us maybe 3 hours of daylight to continue the search. Standard protocol would be to establish a base camp and call for additional searchers. Special circumstances protocol required different considerations. James, what do you know about traditional ecological knowledge? You mean like indigenous land management practices? I mean like the understanding that forests are living communities with their own forms of consciousness and governance. That some places have guardians who enforce ancient agreements about how humans should behave in wild spaces. James stared at me. Are you talking about Bigfoot? I'm talking about the education system that's been operating in these woods for thousands of years. Robert Chen came here thinking he could dominate the landscape, prove his mastery over nature. The forest has methods for correcting that attitude. David, you're talking about supernatural intervention in a missing person case. That's not. A low whistle echoed through the trees. Not a bird call, not wind through branches. Something else. Something calling attention to itself without revealing location or intention. James reached for his radio. Base, this is Ranger Martinez. We're following up on the Robert Chen search and hearing unidentified audio signals at our current location. Static, then William's voice, strangely flat. Roger, Martinez. Proceed with cultural sensitivity protocols. Ranger Running Bear will advise on local consultation procedures, cultural sensitivity protocols. James looked at me. What does that mean? It means we wait, and we listen, and we show respect for educational processes that don't appear in federal guidelines. The whistle came again, closer this time, then another from a different direction, then a third, forming a triangle of sound around our position. David, I think we should call for backup. The backup is already here. They've been here for centuries. Through the trees, I caught glimpses of movement. Shadows that moved independently of wind patterns, too large and too coordinated to be animals. The whistling continued, now accompanied by what sounded like wood knocking, the rapid percussion of hardwood striking hollow trees. They're communicating, I said. Who's communicating? The same guardians who've been managing human behavior in these forests since before there were rangers or permits or leave no trace principles. Robert Chen needs education. They're discussing how to provide it. James was reaching for his sidearm when Robert Chen walked into our clearing. He looked different, cleaner somehow, despite having been in the woods for 5 days. His expensive outdoor clothing had been replaced with simple pants and shirt made from what looked like woven plant fibers. His boots were gone. He wore soft moccasins that made no sound as he moved. Robert? I called. He approached us calmly, showing no signs of distress or disorientation. When he spoke, his voice carried a different quality. Quieter, more thoughtful. Ranger, I've been waiting for you. Waiting where? We've been searching for 2 days. I've been learning. About the forest, about my place in it. About the damage I was doing without understanding. James whispered. He looks drugged. Pupils normal. But his affect is completely different. Robert, do you remember setting up camp in the sacred meadow? Carving your initials in the old-growth pine? Robert's face showed genuine distress. I remember. I was trying to prove something to myself, I think. That I could conquer wild spaces, leave my mark on places that had never been marked. I understand now how arrogant that was. Where have you been for the past 3 days? Learning. The guardians showed me how the forest works, how everything connects. They showed me what happens when someone takes more than they give, marks what should remain unmarked. He rolled up his sleeves. His arms were covered with intricate patterns that looked like traditional Native American designs. but drawn in what appeared to be temporary ink made from plant materials. "These are lessons," he said. "Each symbol represents something I needed to understand about respect, about reciprocity, about living in harmony with natural systems." James was taking pictures with his phone, but the images weren't recording properly. Every photo showed nothing but forest shadows, as if Robert wasn't there at all. "Robert, we need to get you back to the ranger station for medical evaluation." "I understand, but first I need to repair the damage I caused." For the next 2 hours, Robert led us back to each of his campsites. At every location, he methodically restored what he'd disturbed. Fire rings were dismantled and stones returned to their original positions. Carved initials were carefully covered with tree sap and moss. Scattered trash was collected and packed out. At the sacred meadow, he rebuilt the stone cairn he'd destroyed, apologizing to the space in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. "Where did you learn to speak Chinook?" I asked. "The Guardians taught me. They said it was important to apologize in the language of the people who first made agreements with this place." James documented everything, but his equipment continued malfunctioning. Radio transmissions came through as static. GPS readings showed impossible coordinates. Digital cameras captured empty forest where Robert was clearly visible to our eyes. By the time we reached the parking area, Robert had returned to something approaching normal behavior. He packed his expensive gear with obvious distaste, as if the objects represented a version of himself he no longer recognized. "I'm going to sell all this," he said. "Buy something simple, something that works with the forest instead of trying to dominate it." "Robert, can you describe what happened during the 3 days you were missing?" He thought for a long moment. "I was educated about the difference between visiting wild places and invading them, about the responsibility that comes with privilege, about the fact that the forest has its own forms of intelligence and will defend itself when necessary." "Can you describe who provided this education?" "Teachers, guardians, the same beings who've been protecting these places since long before there were parks or rangers or permits. They're not monsters, Ranger. They're librarians of ancient knowledge." That night, Robert drove back to Portland. 3 weeks later, I received a letter from him. He'd sold his outdoor equipment company and was enrolling in a graduate program in Indigenous Environmental Studies. The letter included a donation to local tribal conservation programs and a request never to be contacted about his experience in the North Valley. James filed a standard report. Missing hiker found disoriented but unharmed. No signs of foul play. Released to his own care. But he kept asking questions. "David, there's something happening in these woods that's not in any of our training materials." "There's something happening in these woods that's older than our training materials." "Are you telling me the Park Service has formal protocols for dealing with, what, supernatural intervention?" "I'm telling you the Park Service has informal protocols for working with educational systems that were established long before there was a Park Service. And Rangers Williams and the others know about this." "Rangers Williams and the others know that some visitors require lessons that can't be provided through interpretive programs and campfire talks. They know that these forests have their own methods for teaching respect, and that sometimes our job is to facilitate rather than interfere." James looked at me carefully. "Are you asking me to cover up paranormal activity?" "I'm asking you to recognize that paranormal is just a word we use for natural systems we haven't learned to understand yet. The Guardians aren't violating natural law, they're enforcing it." 3 days later, James submitted his resignation and transferred to a desk job in Sacramento. His replacement was Ranger Kevin Walsh, a 20-year veteran with experience in Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. Kevin's first question after reviewing the Robert Chen file: "How many active Guardians are we working with, and what's their current assessment of visitor education needs?" I knew Kevin would work out just fine. Ranger Kevin Walsh had been in the Cascade Forest for 6 months when the Williams situation developed. Kevin understood the Guardian protocol instinctively. Some people just recognize ancient systems when they encounter them. He'd worked with similar arrangements in Alaska, where Tliniot Rangers maintained relationships with what they called the forest teachers. "The difference up north," Kevin explained during one of our evening debriefings, "is that the tribal communities are still actively involved in the education process. Down here, the Guardians have been working independently for decades." "Independently how?" "No human intermediaries, no cultural context for the people who get educated. They receive the lessons, but they don't understand the broader framework of why those lessons exist." Kevin was right. Sarah Chen had learned respect for sacred trees, but she couldn't have explained the tribal traditions that made those trees sacred. Robert Chen had learned about reciprocity, But he didn't understand the indigenous land management practices that had maintained forest health for millennia. The guardians were performing their function, but without human cultural translation, the education was incomplete. That changed when Williams disappeared. The call came from his wife on a Thursday morning. Williams hadn't returned from what he'd described as a routine consultation in the South Ridge area. No overnight camping gear, no indication he'd planned to stay beyond the workday. His truck was found at the Boundary Creek trailhead with his radio, GPS unit, and service weapon locked inside. "How long has Ranger Williams been missing?" asked Superintendent Patricia Hayes during the emergency briefing. 18 hours, I replied. His shift ended at 6 p.m. yesterday. His wife expected him home by 8. What was the nature of his consultation? Kevin and I exchanged glances. Williams had mentioned the South Ridge consultation to both of us, but with different explanations. He'd told Kevin he was investigating reports of unauthorized camping. He'd told me he was meeting with tribal representatives about traditional use permits. "We're not certain," Kevin said carefully. His activity log shows a scheduled field assessment, but no specific details. Superintendent Hayes reviewed Williams' file. 23 years of service, perfect safety record, expert knowledge of backcountry areas. Not someone who would get lost or encounter routine problems. "I'm calling in a full search team," she decided. "This is an experienced ranger, not a recreational hiker. We treat this as potentially serious from the beginning." By noon, we had 20 searchers spread across the South Ridge area. The Boundary Creek Trail was well maintained and clearly marked, running 6.8 miles through mixed forest to a scenic overlook. Williams' planned route should have taken 3 hours maximum. We found his first marker at 1.2 miles, a small stack of stones beside the trail, arranged in the traditional pattern that indicated a message for other rangers. The message, written in Williams' handwriting on Park Service stationery, was brief. Consultation proceeding as planned. Exercise cultural sensitivity protocols. "Cultural sensitivity protocols for what?" asked Ranger Thompson, part of the search team. "Standard procedure when working with tribal consultants," I said. But Williams had never mentioned tribal involvement in South Ridge activities. At mile marker 3.4, we found his second note, this one less formal. "Meeting with Joseph Running Bear regarding boundary clarifications. May extend past scheduled return time." Kevin looked at me sharply. "Your grandfather?" "My grandfather's been dead for 3 years. That stopped the search team." Williams had been communicating with someone he believed was my grandfather, but Joseph Running Bear was buried in the Klamath Tribal Cemetery outside Chiloquin. I'd attended his funeral. "David," Kevin said quietly, "we need to discuss some possibilities that might not be comfortable for the other searchers." I understood. "Thompson, establish base camp at mile marker 3. Continue standard grid search patterns. Kevin and I will investigate the consultation Williams mentioned." Kevin and I continued up the trail alone. The South Ridge area was different from North Valley or Whispering Pines. Older, wilder, with sections of old-growth forest that had never been logged. The kind of place where traditional boundaries between human and natural communities became less distinct. At mile marker 5.1, we found Williams' service belt, radio, flashlight, first aid kit, all arranged neatly on a fallen log. No signs of struggle, no indication of emergency. The equipment had been placed there deliberately, as if Williams had decided he no longer needed standard ranger gear. "This is the same pattern we saw with Robert Chen," Kevin observed. "Systematic abandonment of modern equipment." But Robert was receiving education about environmental respect. Williams already understood that. He's been facilitating Guardian protocols for years. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe he's been facilitating without understanding. At mile marker 6.2, we heard voices. 2 people having a conversation too distant to make out words but close enough to follow. Kevin and I moved carefully toward the sound, staying on the established trail but ready to move into cover if necessary. The trail ended at the South Ridge overlook, but the voices continued from a location that shouldn't have existed, beyond the overlook, in space that dropped away into empty air. Following the sound, we discovered a narrow path leading down from the overlook through dense undergrowth. The path wasn't on any Park Service map, but it was well maintained and showed signs of regular use. Stone steps had been carved into steep sections, and wooden railings provided stability at dangerous points. "This path is professionally constructed," Kevin noted. "But there's no record of trail work in this area." Professional by whose standards? The path descended for perhaps 500 feet, ending in a circular clearing surrounded by massive cedar trees. In the center of the clearing was a structure I recognized from my grandfather's descriptions, a traditional longhouse, built in the old style with cedar planks and traditional joinery. Smoke rose from a smoke hole in the roof. Voices continued from inside the structure. "That building isn't in any park records," Kevin whispered. "That building predates park records." One of the voices was definitely Williams. The other voice was older, speaking in a mixture of English and what sounded like Chinook jargon. As we approached the longhouse, I began to understand both sides of the conversation. "The agreements were made before your government existed," the older voice was saying. "They remain in effect regardless of administrative changes." "I understand that," Williams replied. "But the current ranger staff doesn't have adequate cultural training to maintain proper relationships. We're operating on instinct and good intentions, but without real knowledge. That has been our concern. The Guardians report that education protocols are successful, but without cultural context. Visitors learn respect but not understanding. They change behavior without changing worldview." "What do you recommend?" "Direct consultation. Your rangers need training in traditional ecological knowledge. The Guardians need human intermediaries who understand both systems, federal land management and indigenous forest governance." Kevin and I looked at each other. Williams wasn't missing, he was in negotiations. I knocked on the doorframe of the longhouse. "Ranger Williams, this is David Running Bear and Kevin Walsh. We've been looking for you." "David." Williams appeared in the doorway. He looked the same as always, but his demeanor was different, more formal, more careful. "Come in. There's someone you need to meet." Inside the longhouse, the ceiling was higher than the exterior suggested, supported by massive carved posts. Traditional woven mats covered the floor and a fire burned in a central pit. The smoke rose straight up through the hole in the roof without dispersing into the interior space. Sitting across the fire from Williams was my grandfather, not someone who looked like my grandfather. Not a vision or hallucination. Joseph Running Bear, exactly as I remembered him, wearing the traditional cedar bark clothing he'd been buried in. "Hello, David. You've grown into the kind of ranger I hoped you'd become." Kevin grabbed my arm. "David, who is that?" "That's my grandfather, who died 3 years ago." "Your grandfather, who's been dead for 3 years, is sitting by a fire in a building that doesn't officially exist, having policy discussions with a missing park ranger." "That's correct." Kevin sat down hard on one of the woven mats. "I thought I understood what we were dealing with here." Joseph smiled. "The Guardians are not the only beings who maintain the forest, Kevin. The human representatives of the old agreements don't cease their responsibilities when they die. They simply operate from different locations." "You're a ghost," Kevin said. "I'm a consultant. The tribal communities signed treaties with your government, but we also maintain older agreements with the forest itself. Those agreements include provisions for ongoing consultation between human and natural governance systems." Williams gestured for us to sit. "Joseph has been explaining why the Guardian protocol isn't working as well as it should. We're treating the education process as individual intervention, but it's actually part of a larger system of ecological management. The Guardians enforce behavioral standards," Joseph continued. "But behavior change without cultural understanding is temporary. Visitors need to learn not just what to do, but why those actions maintain ecological balance." "What are you proposing?" I asked. "Full cultural integration of park management. Rangers trained in traditional ecological knowledge. Formal consultation between Park Service and tribal representatives, both living and ancestral. Recognition that these forests are managed by systems that predate and supersede federal authority." Kevin was taking notes. "The Park Service doesn't have precedent for consulting with deceased tribal elders. The Park Service has precedent for consulting with whoever maintains effective governance over public lands. If the traditional leadership includes people who happen to be deceased, that's an administrative detail." Williams nodded. "Joseph has been mediating between the Guardians and park administration for decades. When rangers like me showed cultural sensitivity, he provided guidance. When visitors needed education, he helped coordinate the process. But it's been informal consultation," Joseph added, "operating without official recognition or systematic implementation. That needs to change." "Change how?" Joseph stood up and walked to one of the carved posts. The post was covered with symbols that looked like traditional Northwest Coast art, but more complex, incorporating elements I didn't recognize. "This is a map of the consultation zones throughout the forest. Each area has specific guardians, specific educational protocols, specific cultural requirements. Your missing persons aren't random events, they're systematic interventions in areas where visitors violate local agreements." Kevin studied the map. There are patterns. The disappearances cluster around locations that show spiritual significance symbols. Exactly. The guardians don't operate randomly. They respond to specific violations of specific agreements in specific areas. But without cultural education, visitors don't understand what agreements they're violating. Williams pulled out a thick folder of files. I've been documenting the education cases for 15 years. Every successful intervention follows the same pattern. Visitors who show fundamental disrespect for natural systems receive intensive education about ecological relationships. When they demonstrate understanding, they're returned to normal life with permanent attitude changes. And the unsuccessful cases, people who refuse to learn, who insist that natural spaces exist for human convenience rather than human participation. They're not harmed, but they're not returned either. Joseph nodded. They become part of the forest community, not as prisoners, but as permanent students, learning respect through direct participation in ecological systems. Kevin looked up from his notes. How many permanent students are we talking about? Currently? About 47, spread across the various consultation zones. Some have been here for decades. They live as part of forest communities, maintaining traditional lifestyles, contributing to ecosystem health, and their families think they're missing or dead. Their families are told what they need to know. But most of the permanent students had no meaningful family connections. They came to wild places seeking escape from human communities that they'd never learned to value. Williams closed his folder. The question is whether the Park Service is ready to work formally with systems that operate outside federal guidelines. What would formal cooperation look like? Joseph walked to another section of the longhouse where tools and equipment were stored. Traditional items, carved bowls, woven baskets, hand-forged knives, alongside modern Park Service gear, ranger training that includes traditional ecological knowledge, formal consultation protocols with tribal representatives, including ancestral leadership, recognition that park management operates within indigenous governance systems rather than replacing them, and in exchange, more effective education protocols, better outcomes for problematic visitors, reduced missing person cases because cultural prevention happens before guardian intervention becomes necessary. Kevin and I looked at Williams. He'd been managing this system informally for years, but formal recognition would require administrative approval from levels of government that didn't believe in the supernatural. The superintendent isn't going to believe that we're consulting with deceased tribal elders about forest management policies, Kevin said. Joseph laughed. The superintendent doesn't have to believe. She just has to implement effective policies. If traditional ecological knowledge produces better outcomes than conventional park management, the source of that knowledge is academically interesting but administratively irrelevant. Williams nodded. We present it as cultural consultation with tribal advisors. The fact that some advisors happen to be deceased is information that doesn't appear in official reports. And if the Guardians approve this arrangement, the Guardians have been waiting for this arrangement for decades. They prefer education that includes cultural context. Individual behavior modification without community understanding is exhausting and largely temporary. Joseph stood up and gestured toward the door. The Guardians would like to meet with both of you, not for education, you already understand respect and reciprocity, but for formal introduction to the consultation process. Kevin and I followed Joseph and Williams out of the longhouse. In the clearing around the building, I counted at least 12 figures waiting for us. Some were clearly the Guardians we'd encountered before, large, hair-covered, moving with the fluid grace of beings perfectly adapted to forest life. Others appeared more human, but dressed in traditional clothing and carrying traditional tools. The Guardian community includes both indigenous forest spirits and human representatives who've chosen to remain as permanent consultants, Joseph explained. Formal cooperation requires relationship with both groups. The largest of the Guardians approached us. When he spoke, his voice carried the same deep resonance I'd heard during the Sarah Chen incident. You understand the old agreements? We're learning, I replied. Learning is the beginning of wisdom. Will you carry messages between our community and your administrative systems? If those messages serve the forest and the people who depend on it. The Guardian studied us for a long moment, then nodded. The consultation begins now. The formal consultation process began with a ceremony I wasn't prepared for. Joseph led Kevin, Williams, and me to a section of the clearing where 13 stones formed a perfect circle. Each stone was carved with symbols that combined traditional Northwest Coast designs with patterns I didn't recognize, geometric forms that seemed to shift depending on the angle of observation. These are the witness stones, Joseph explained, representatives of the original agreements between indigenous communities and the forest guardians. Each stone represents a specific aspect of ecological relationship. The guardians arranged themselves around the stone circle, with the largest figure, who Joseph addressed as first teacher, positioned directly across from us. The human representatives, including several people I recognized from missing person files dating back decades, stood between the guardians and the stones. "This is not a negotiation," first teacher said. "The agreements already exist. This is education about how to implement those agreements within your administrative systems." Joseph gestured for us to sit. The consultation process follows traditional forms. Each stone represents a question that requires understanding before implementation can begin. David, as the descendant of traditional treaty signers, you speak for the human community. Kevin and Williams, as experienced rangers, you speak for administrative implementation. The first stone glowed faintly, not with light but with a quality that made it more visible than the others. The symbol carved into its surface resembled a tree with roots that extended far beyond its canopy. Question 1, Joseph said. What is the true boundary of the forest? I thought about Park Service maps, legal descriptions, survey markers. Then I thought about watershed boundaries, wildlife migration routes, seasonal use patterns. The forest doesn't end at administrative boundaries, I said. It's part of a larger ecosystem that extends across multiple jurisdictions. First teacher nodded. The guardians maintain relationships with forest communities throughout the bioregion. Education protocols operate wherever those communities exist, regardless of human political boundaries. Kevin raised his hand. From an administrative perspective, that creates jurisdictional problems. We can coordinate within our park boundaries, but we can't implement policies in state forests or private lands. You cannot implement policies, first teacher agreed. But you can participate in protocols that extend beyond your jurisdictional authority. The forest communities coordinate their own activities. Williams understood first. We're not taking over forest management in other jurisdictions. We're joining an existing management system that operates across all jurisdictions. The second stone began glowing. Its symbol showed human figures arranged in a complex pattern around what appeared to be a central fire. Question 2. What is the human community's responsibility to the forest community? This question was harder. I thought about leave no trace principles, about resource conservation, about wildlife protection. But those concepts seemed inadequate for what was being asked. Reciprocity, I said finally. The forest provides services to human communities. Clean water, air quality, resources, spiritual renewal. Human communities need to provide equivalent services to the forest. What services can humans provide to forest communities? Kevin answered. Cultural preservation, maintaining traditional ecological knowledge, defending forest communities from exploitation and development, and personal participation, Williams added. Not just policy implementation, but individual commitment to forest welfare. First teacher gestured to the human representative standing around the circle. Some people find that their best service to forest communities involves permanent residence and direct participation in ecological maintenance. Others serve through cultural translation and administrative mediation. I looked at the faces of the permanent residents. Some I recognized from old missing person files. People who disappeared in suspicious circumstances, leaving behind no forwarding addresses or explanations. They looked healthy, purposeful, engaged in meaningful work. Not like prisoners or victims, but like people who'd found their proper place in the world. How do you determine who becomes a permanent resident versus who returns to human communities? Choice and aptitude, replied a woman I recognized from a 1987 missing person case. Some people discover that forest communities offer more meaningful life than the human communities they left. Others find that their service is more effective as intermediaries. What about families? People who are missed. Most permanent residents had no significant family attachments, she continued. And those who did usually discover that forest families provide more authentic relationships than the communities they abandoned. The third stone began glowing. Its symbol showed intertwined spirals that seemed to move even while I watched them. Question 3. How do natural law and human law interact? This was the question I'd been dreading. Park Service policies were based on federal law, state law, local ordinances. Natural law, the ecological relationships that determined how forest communities functioned, operated by different principles entirely. Natural law is primary, I said, hoping I understood correctly. Human law is effective only when it aligns with natural law. When they conflict, natural law prevails. Explain what that means for administrative implementation. Kevin looked uncomfortable. It means we implement Park Service policies that support ecological relationships, and we interpret policies that conflict with ecological relationships. It means, Williams said more directly, that we serve the forest first and the bureaucracy second. When federal guidelines produce ecological damage, we follow ecological guidelines instead. First teacher nodded approvingly. Guardian education protocols operate under natural law. Administrative cooperation requires understanding that some interventions will occur regardless of human policy preferences, but we can help those interventions be more effective, I added. Better cultural preparation for visitors, more appropriate responses to guardian education, integration of traditional ecological knowledge into park management. The fourth stone glowed. Its symbol showed human and animal figures sharing what appeared to be a common space or structure. Question 4. How do human and natural communities share territory? Overlap, I said immediately. Not separate areas for separate communities, but integrated spaces where different communities participate in the same ecological systems. That's harder to implement administratively, Kevin said. Visitor management, resource protection, safety protocols, they're all based on human/nature separation. Those protocols need to change, Williams replied. Instead of managing human impact on natural systems, we need to manage human participation in natural systems. First teacher gestured to the longhouse and the cleared areas around it. This consultation facility exists within park boundaries but under natural law. Visitors who receive education here are participating in forest community activities rather than consuming park services. How do we explain that to the superintendent? Joseph laughed. You explain that traditional ecological knowledge improves visitor education outcomes. You explain that cultural consultation reduces problematic behaviors. You explain that indigenous approaches to land management are more effective than conventional approaches. You don't explain, he continued, that some consultants happen to be deceased, or that some educational facilities exist in locations that don't appear on official maps, or that some visitors receive education in forms that federal guidelines don't recognize. The fifth stone began glowing. Its symbol was the most complex yet, geometric patterns that seemed to include representations of trees, mountains, rivers, and human settlements in a unified design. Question 5. How does this consultation affect broader relationships between indigenous communities and federal land management? I thought about treaty rights, about the history of conflict between tribal sovereignty and federal authority, about the decades of struggle over resource access and cultural preservation. It demonstrates that traditional ecological knowledge is more effective than conventional park management, I said. It establishes precedent for formal consultation with tribal communities on policy implementation. It recognizes that indigenous governance systems continue to operate within federal jurisdictions, Kevin nodded, and it provides a model for cooperation rather than conflict. Instead of fighting over jurisdictional authority, we're collaborating on shared environmental objectives. Most importantly, Williams added, it demonstrates that some governance systems operate at scales beyond human political organization. The forest communities don't recognize federal authority, but they're willing to cooperate with human communities that demonstrate ecological understanding. First teacher stood up and the other guardians followed his lead. The consultation is complete. You understand the framework for cooperation. Implementation begins with your return to administrative duties. What do we tell Superintendent Hayes about William's disappearance? Joseph gestured toward the path leading back to the overlook. You tell her that consultation with tribal advisors took longer than expected, but produced significant improvements in park management protocols. Williams returns to duty with enhanced cultural training and expanded responsibilities for visitor education. Enhanced responsibilities. Williams becomes the formal liaison between park administration and traditional ecological management systems. His job description expands to include cultural consultation, traditional knowledge integration, and specialized visitor education protocols. Williams looked thoughtful. That's a significant change in my role. I'll need administrative approval for expanded responsibilities. You'll need administrative recognition of responsibilities you've been performing informally for 15 years, Joseph corrected. The change is an official acknowledgement, not an actual function. We walked back up the path to the South Ridge overlook. The late afternoon sun filtered through old-growth branches, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed more meaningful than I'd noticed before. The forest felt different now, not like a place I worked, but like a community I participated in. At the parking area, Williams retrieved his equipment from the truck and checked in with the search team. Consultation completed successfully. All personnel returned to base. Kevin and I rode back to the ranger station in thoughtful silence. The conversation we'd just participated in would affect every aspect of our work, but in ways that couldn't be documented in official reports. "David," Kevin said finally, "how do we implement what we just learned without violating federal employment policies? We implement better outcomes through methods that don't require detailed explanation. If visitor education improves, if missing person incidents decrease, if park management becomes more effective, the specific techniques become administratively irrelevant. And if supervisors ask direct questions about our methods, we explain that we're using traditional ecological knowledge and cultural consultation to enhance conventional park management. That's completely accurate, and it doesn't require mentioning details that supervisors aren't prepared to understand." Back at the ranger station, Superintendent Hayes was waiting for our report. "Ranger Williams, I understand your consultation extended longer than scheduled." "Yes, ma'am. The tribal advisors provided extensive information about traditional ecological management that will significantly improve our visitor education protocols." "What kind of improvements?" Williams looked at me, then back at Hayes. "Cultural context for leave no trace principles, traditional knowledge about seasonal use patterns and wildlife behavior, enhanced techniques for managing problematic visitor behaviors. Can you document these improvements for inclusion in our next administrative review?" "I can document improved outcomes. The specific cultural knowledge would need to be reviewed by tribal representatives before formal documentation." Hayes nodded. "Understood. Implement whatever improvements you can, and coordinate with tribal relations staff on appropriate documentation procedures." That night, Kevin and I stayed late to revise our incident reports and visitor education materials. The changes were subtle but significant. Instead of emphasizing human impact on natural systems, we emphasized human participation in natural systems. Instead of describing wildlife as separate from human communities, we described ecological relationships that included human participants. The new approaches felt right in ways that traditional Park Service methods never had. We were no longer managing human intrusion into natural spaces. We were facilitating human integration into ecological communities, but the real test would come with the next problematic visitor. The next person who came to the forest with attitudes that required guardian intervention. The question was whether our enhanced cultural preparation would reduce the need for intensive education, or whether some people would still require the traditional methods. 3 days later, we got our answer. The test came sooner and more dramatically than expected. A group of 12 people calling themselves wilderness dominators had reserved the North Valley camping area for what they described as a survival mastery expedition. Their permit application listed the group leader as Marcus Kane, a self-proclaimed wilderness expert who ran corporate team-building programs designed to teach conquest of natural challenges. Their equipment list was alarming. Military surplus gear, extensive rope and climbing equipment, chainsaws, and what appeared to be demolition supplies for clearing natural obstacles. The permit should never have been approved, but it had passed through normal channels before our new protocols were implemented. "This is exactly the kind of group that triggers guardian interventions," Williams observed during our pre-arrival briefing. 12 people with dominance attitudes, planning to master wilderness through technological superiority. Kevin studied their social media postings, which had been documenting their preparation for weeks. Photos showed them practicing with axes, studying military survival manuals, and posing with equipment designed for maximum environmental impact. "Look at their mission statement," Kevin said, reading from their website. "Modern humans have become weak through dependence on civilization. True strength comes from proving your dominance over natural forces. We teach participants to conquer wilderness through superior planning, technology, and willpower." "They're coming here specifically to violate every ecological principle the Guardians protect," I said. "This isn't accidental disrespect, it's intentional aggression against natural systems." Williams nodded. "Under the old protocols, we'd wait for them to trigger Guardian intervention, then manage the educational aftermath. Under the new protocols, we provide cultural preparation to prevent the need for intensive education. Cultural preparation for people who've explicitly rejected cultural values in favor of dominance psychology? That's the test. Can traditional ecological knowledge reach people who've organized their identities around opposition to traditional ecological knowledge?" The wilderness dominators arrived at 10 a.m. on a Friday morning, driving 3 oversized vehicles loaded with enough equipment to supply a military expedition. Marcus Kane was exactly what I'd expected. 6'4", military-bearing, expensive outdoor clothing designed to project authority rather than functionality. "Rangers," he called as his group unloaded gear. We're the wilderness dominators here to show this forest what human determination can accomplish. His team members looked like corporate executives, playing soldier, soft hands, expensive boots, the kind of people who thought wilderness was a commodity to be consumed rather than a community to be respected. Williams approached with his usual professional demeanor. Mr. Kane, I'm Ranger Williams. We need to conduct a brief orientation session before you proceed to your camping area. Orientation for what? We've done our research. We know what we're doing. Standard protocol for groups using advanced equipment in ecologically sensitive areas. It'll take about an hour, and it's required for permit compliance. Kane looked annoyed, but he gathered his team for the orientation session. Williams had prepared a presentation that emphasized traditional ecological knowledge without explicitly mentioning guardians or supernatural enforcement mechanisms. The North Valley area has been continuously inhabited by indigenous communities for over 8,000 years, Williams began. Current forest conditions reflect thousands of years of traditional management practices. Understanding those practices improves modern outdoor recreation experiences. Kane interrupted. We're not here for a history lesson. We're here to test human capability against natural challenges. Understanding the history helps you recognize which challenges are natural and which are artifacts of poor management. Traditional ecological knowledge identifies sustainable interaction methods that enhance rather than degrade wilderness experiences. Williams showed slides of traditional tool use, sustainable camping practices, and seasonal resource management. The information was presented as practical advice for wilderness recreation, but the underlying message was clear. The forest was a managed system that operated according to specific principles. This is all very interesting, Kane said impatiently, but we're using modern methods that are more efficient than primitive techniques. Modern methods are more efficient for some objectives, Williams agreed. Traditional methods are more efficient for other objectives. Combining both approaches produces optimal outcomes. One of Kane's team members, a woman named Jennifer, asked, "What happens if people don't follow traditional practices?" Williams looked at me. This was the moment when we had to provide cultural preparation without revealing enforcement mechanisms. People who demonstrate disrespect for traditional ecological principles often have educational experiences that change their perspectives, I said carefully. The forest has methods for teaching appropriate relationship principles. What kind of methods? Kane asked suspiciously. Intensive cultural immersion. People learn through direct participation in ecological systems. It's very effective, but it requires significant time commitment. How significant? Depends on how quickly people internalize the lessons. Some learn respect and reciprocity in a few days. Others require months or years of education. Kane laughed. Are you threatening us with some kind of wilderness re-education camp? I'm informing you that this forest operates according to traditional ecological principles, and that people who violate those principles reliably receive educational opportunities to develop better understanding. Williams concluded the orientation by offering traditional camping gear, simple tools, low-impact equipment, cultural guides for appropriate resource use. Kane's team declined everything. We didn't come here to play primitive camping games, Kane said. We came here to prove that modern humans can dominate any natural environment through superior technology and planning. That's your choice, Williams replied. You'll find the experience very educational. Kevin and I monitored the Wilderness Dominators' progress through their first day in the North Valley. They established base camp in the Sacred Meadow, despite clear guidance to use designated camping areas, built an unnecessary fire ring using stones from ancient formations, and began what they called forest modification projects. Cutting trails, clearing undergrowth, and carving directional markers into old-growth trees. By evening, their activities had escalated to systematic destruction. Chainsaws cutting living trees for camp improvement, explosives to remove natural obstacles that interfered with their planned activities, graffiti marking territories they claimed to have conquered. They're not just violating leave-no-trace principles, Kevin observed. They're conducting warfare against the forest ecosystem. The Guardians must be watching this, I said. How are they restraining themselves? Williams checked his radio, which had been crackling with static all afternoon. I don't think they're restraining themselves. I think they're coordinating a comprehensive educational response. At 8:47 p.m., Marcus Kane called the ranger station on his satellite phone. We're experiencing equipment failures, GPS units showing impossible readings, radios picking up transmissions in foreign languages, digital cameras malfunctioning. That's not unusual in the North Valley area, Williams replied. Electronic equipment often has problems there. Problems like what? Electromagnetic interference from natural sources. The traditional solution is to rely on non-electronic navigation and communication methods. We didn't bring non-electronic equipment. We're modern people using modern methods. I understand. Do you need assistance? Kane was quiet for a moment. Not yet, but if conditions worsen, we may need evacuation support. Evacuation support is available, but educational opportunities are also available. Traditional ecological knowledge can help you work with local conditions rather than against them. I'm not interested in primitive survival techniques. That's your choice. Call if circumstances change. At 11:23 p.m., Kane called again. We're hearing sounds we can't identify. Large animals moving around our campsite but staying outside visual range. Vocalizations that don't match any known species. Those would be the local wildlife expressing concern about your activities. The forest communities don't appreciate systematic destruction of ecological infrastructure. Forest communities, the integrated animal and plant networks that maintain ecosystem stability. When those networks are damaged, the communities respond to protect themselves. Are you saying the animals are coordinating some kind of response to our presence? I'm saying that forest ecosystems include communication systems that allow coordinated responses to threats. Your activities represent a significant threat to ecosystem stability. What kind of coordinated responses? Educational initiatives designed to help people understand appropriate relationship principles. Kane was quiet for longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its aggressive confidence. Educational initiatives involving wildlife, educational initiatives involving all components of forest communities, wildlife, plant networks, geological systems, and indigenous governance structures. Indigenous governance structures, traditional ecological management systems that have been operating in this area for thousands of years. They include protocols for educating people who demonstrate disrespect for natural communities. Ranger Williams, are you telling me that there are indigenous people in this forest who are monitoring our activities? I'm telling you that traditional ecological management systems are still operational, and that they include educational protocols for people who violate established ecological principles. At 2:14 a.m., Kane called for the third time. His voice was different now, quieter, less certain. Ranger, we need to discuss evacuation procedures. What's changed? The sounds have gotten closer and more organized, like they're communicating about us, planning something. They probably are. Forest communities don't tolerate systematic ecological destruction. Educational interventions are likely being coordinated. Educational interventions by wild animals, educational interventions by forest community representatives. Some of those representatives are animals, others are different. Different how? Williams looked at Kevin and me. Kane was approaching the point where cultural preparation might prevent the need for intensive guardian education. But he had to be ready to accept traditional ecological knowledge instead of fighting it. Mr. Kane, the North Valley area is home to educational specialists who work with people who need to learn appropriate forest relationship principles. These specialists use traditional methods that are extremely effective, but require significant time commitment and attitude adjustment. Educational specialists. What kind of educational specialists? Indigenous forest community representatives. They've been providing education about ecological relationships for thousands of years. They're very skilled at helping people understand their proper place in natural systems. Are you talking about tribal representatives? Among others, yes. Where are they? We haven't seen any people besides our own group. They prefer to observe before making contact. They're currently assessing your educational needs and planning appropriate interventions. Kane was quiet for almost 5 minutes. When he spoke again, the aggression was gone entirely. Ranger Williams, I think we may have made some mistakes in our approach to this expedition. What kind of mistakes? We came here thinking we could dominate the forest through superior technology, but the forest seems to be responding to our activities in ways we didn't expect. The forest is responding to ecological damage through traditional protection mechanisms. Those mechanisms include educational opportunities for people who are willing to learn different approaches. Educational opportunities that don't require intensive intervention. If people demonstrate genuine willingness to learn, the education can be collaborative rather than immersive. What would collaborative education involve? Williams smiled. Participation in traditional ecological practices, learning sustainable relationship methods, demonstrating respect for forest community principles, and immersive education, extended residence in forest communities until appropriate attitudes are developed. Some people find immersive education very rewarding. but it requires abandoning previous lifestyle assumptions. Another long silence. Ranger Williams, would it be possible for forest community representatives to provide collaborative education for our group? That would depend on whether your group is genuinely ready to abandon dominance approaches in favor of relationship approaches. I think we're ready to try different approaches. I'll make some inquiries. But first, your group needs to repair the ecological damage you've caused today. How do we do that? Dismantle the fire ring and return stones to their original locations. Remove graffiti from trees and treat the wounds with natural healing compounds. Restore modified areas to their previous conditions. Demonstrate that you understand the difference between participation and exploitation. We can do that. Begin immediately. Ecological restoration work needs to be completed before educational consultation can begin. At sunrise, Kevin and I hiked to the North Valley to assess the Wilderness Dominators' restoration efforts. The change in the group was remarkable. Kane and his team were working methodically to repair the damage they'd caused, using hand tools instead of power equipment, consulting with each other about the best methods for ecological restoration. Jennifer approached us as we entered their camp area. Rangers, we've been working all night to fix what we damaged, but we don't know if we're doing it correctly. It looks like you're making good progress, Kevin observed. What changed your approach? We realized we were fighting the forest instead of learning from it, and we started hearing guidance about better methods. Guidance from whom? She gestured toward the tree line. The educational specialists Ranger Williams mentioned. They've been teaching us about traditional ecological practices. I looked where she pointed and saw several figures standing in the shadows between trees. Human figures wearing traditional clothing, observing the restoration work and occasionally offering advice in quiet voices. Kane approached us, looking remarkably different from the aggressive expedition leader who'd arrived yesterday. Rangers, I owe you an apology. We came here with completely wrong attitudes about wilderness relationships. What's changed your perspective? The educational specialists explained that forests are communities, not resources. That appropriate human participation involves contribution to community welfare rather than extraction from community assets. Williams arrived with Joseph Running Bear, who was visible to all members of the Wilderness Dominators group. The cultural preparation had worked. Instead of seeing Joseph as a supernatural apparition, they recognized him as an indigenous educator providing traditional ecological knowledge. Joseph has agreed to provide collaborative education for your group, Williams announced. But it requires genuine commitment to learning traditional relationship principles. Kane nodded. We're ready to learn. We realize our original approach was not just ineffective, but actively harmful. Joseph smiled. Learning begins with understanding that humans are participants in forest communities, not masters of forest resources. Are you ready to understand yourselves as participants? Yes, sir. Then education begins now. For the next 3 days, Joseph and the other traditional educators worked with the Wilderness Dominators group. Instead of dominance training, they received instruction in sustainable camping, traditional tool use, plant identification, wildlife behavior, and ecological relationship principles. The group's transformation was complete. By the time they left, they were planning to redesign their entire program around traditional ecological knowledge and sustainable wilderness practices. This is what successful cultural preparation looks like, Williams observed. Educational intervention before guardian intervention becomes necessary, Kevin nodded. But it only works with people who are capable of abandoning dominance attitudes when confronted with evidence that those attitudes are destructive. What about people who refuse cultural preparation? They receive traditional education through immersive methods. The guardians are still available for people who require more intensive learning opportunities. 2 weeks later, Marcus Kane contacted the ranger station with a request to bring corporate clients for traditional ecological education programs. His Wilderness Dominators organization had been completely restructured around sustainable relationship principles. Superintendent Hayes reviewed our incident reports with obvious approval. Whatever cultural consultation methods you're using, they're producing remarkable improvements in visitor behavior. I want you to expand these programs to other problem areas. We'll coordinate with tribal advisors about appropriate expansion, Williams replied, and the missing person statistics have dropped to 0 for the past month. That's the best safety record in the park system. Traditional ecological knowledge includes very effective safety protocols, I said. Document whatever you can about these methods. Other parks need similar programs. That night, Kevin and I walked back to the South Ridge overlook. The path to the consultation facility was clearly visible now, as if it had always been part of the official trail system. The longhouse glowed with warm light, and smoke rose steadily from the fire pit. "David," Kevin said, "do you think we're still park rangers, or have we become something else?" "We're still park rangers, but we're park rangers who understand that parks exist within larger systems of ecological governance that include both human and natural communities, and those larger systems include beings that most people would consider supernatural. Those larger systems include beings that operate according to natural laws we're still learning to understand. Whether we call them supernatural or not is less important than whether we can work cooperatively with them to protect forest communities." Inside the longhouse, Joseph was meeting with a group of visitors who'd requested traditional ecological education. The visitors looked engaged and respectful, participating in discussions about sustainable relationship principles rather than receiving intensive correction of problematic attitudes. "The consultation protocols are working," Joseph told us. "More people are choosing collaborative education, fewer people require immersive intervention. The guardians are pleased with the improved outcomes." First teacher emerged from the shadows around the fire pit. "The integration is successful. Human and natural governance systems are coordinating effectively. Forest communities are healthier, human education is more complete, administrative cooperation is functional." "What happens now?" Williams asked. "Now the model expands. Other forest communities have been observing these protocols. They're ready to implement similar consultation systems with their local human administrators." "How many other forest communities?" "Every significant forest ecosystem in North America includes guardian communities and traditional governance systems. Most have been operating independently since formal treaty relationships ended. But successful integration here demonstrates that cooperative management is possible." Kevin looked thoughtful. "Are we talking about a fundamental change in how public lands are managed?" "We're talking about recognition that public lands were never unmanaged. Indigenous governance systems continued operating within federal jurisdictions. Successful cooperation requires acknowledgement of those systems and integration with federal administrative processes." I thought about the implications. Hundreds of national forests, thousands of park rangers, millions of visitors, all potentially participating in integrated ecological management that combine traditional indigenous knowledge with federal land management policies. "It's going to take time to train rangers in traditional ecological knowledge." Joseph smiled. "Training has already begun. Rangers who demonstrate cultural sensitivity are being introduced to consultation protocols in their own areas. The process is expanding at the rate that human administrative systems can adapt, and rangers who don't demonstrate cultural sensitivity will continue operating under conventional protocols until they develop readiness for expanded approaches," First teacher replied. "Not everyone is prepared for integrated management immediately, but everyone who works in forest communities will eventually encounter traditional governance systems," Joseph added. "The choice is whether they encounter those systems through cooperation or correction." We stayed at the longhouse until well past midnight, discussing implementation strategies and coordination procedures. The conversation felt historic, not just for park management, but for the broader relationship between indigenous and federal governance systems. When we finally returned to the ranger station, Superintendent Hayes was waiting with a message from the regional office. "Washington wants a full report on your cultural consultation programs," she said. "They're considering implementing similar approaches throughout the park system." Williams looked at Kevin and me. "We'll coordinate with our tribal advisors about appropriate documentation procedures. How soon can you have a preliminary report ready?" "Traditional consultation requires extensive discussion and consensus building," I replied. "But we should have recommendations within a few weeks." Hayes nodded. "Take whatever time you need. These programs are producing the best outcomes we've seen in decades." After Hayes left, the three of us sat in the ranger station, considering what we'd committed to documenting. A report that would recommend integrating federal park management with traditional indigenous governance systems, based on consultation with tribal representatives who happen to include deceased community elders and forest guardians who didn't fit standard definitions of human or animal. "How do we write a federal report about supernatural consultation protocols?" Kevin asked. "We write a federal report about traditional ecological knowledge and cultural consultation producing improved outcomes through methods that require ongoing indigenous community guidance," Williams replied. "And if supervisors ask for specifics about consultation methods, we explain that traditional knowledge systems operate according to indigenous cultural protocols that require respectful approach rather than detailed documentation," I said. "In other words, we tell the truth without providing details that federal administrators aren't prepared to understand." understand. Exactly. 6 months later, the Cascade Forest Traditional Ecological Knowledge Pilot Program had been approved for implementation throughout the Pacific Northwest region. Ranger training programs now included courses in indigenous land management principles, cultural consultation protocols, and sustainable visitor education methods. Missing person incidents had dropped to unprecedented lows. Visitor satisfaction surveys showed remarkable improvements in wilderness experience quality. Environmental impact assessments showed measurable improvement in ecosystem health. Federal administrators praised the program for demonstrating that cultural consultation could enhance rather than complicate effective park management. They didn't need to know that some cultural consultants operated from longhouses that didn't appear on official maps, or that some educational interventions were provided by forest community representatives who didn't fit standard definitions of human educators. The important thing was that the system worked. Traditional ecological knowledge integrated successfully with federal land management policies. Indigenous governance systems operated cooperatively with Park Service Administration. Forest communities were healthier, human education was more effective, and the ancient agreements between indigenous communities and the land were honored through modern institutional recognition. But the most important outcome was personal. I was no longer a park ranger who occasionally encountered supernatural mysteries that couldn't be explained or documented. I was a park ranger who participated in an integrated ecological management system that recognized the full complexity of forest community relationships. When people asked about my work, I could explain that I helped coordinate between human and natural governance systems to maintain healthy ecological relationships. That was completely accurate, and it didn't require mentioning that some governance systems included deceased tribal elders and forest guardians whose existence challenged conventional understanding of what was possible. Every morning, I checked in with the consultation facility at South Ridge. Every evening, I filed reports that documented improved outcomes through traditional ecological knowledge and cultural consultation. Every night, I fell asleep knowing that the forests I served were managed by systems that had maintained ecological health for thousands of years, and that my role was to help those systems continue their work through changing political and cultural conditions. The forest was no longer a place I worked. It was a community I served. And that community included representatives, both human and natural, who were committed to maintaining the ancient agreements that kept the land healthy for all its inhabitants. The Guardian Protocol had evolved into something larger and more complete. The Integration Protocol, human and natural governance systems working together to maintain ecological health through traditional knowledge, contemporary administration, and the recognition that some relationships transcend the boundaries between human and natural communities. The following account represents my 15 years of experience in forest management and search and rescue operations. I'm documenting these events because someone needs to know what really happened to the Hartwell family. What I'm about to tell you violates several departmental protocols, but after what I witnessed, protocols seem like a luxury we can no longer afford. My name is Thomas Mitchell, and I've been a park ranger for the Olympic National Forest for 15 years. During that time, I've seen my share of missing persons cases, wildlife encounters, and the occasional unexplained incident that never quite makes it into the official reports. But nothing in my training prepared me for what happened during the 5 days in September that changed everything I thought I knew about these woods. The Olympic Peninsula is a massive expanse of temperate rainforest, over 900,000 acres of some of the most pristine wilderness left in the continental United States. Most visitors stick to the main trails and established campgrounds, but every year we get a few ambitious groups who venture into the backcountry areas where cell service dies and GPS units start spinning like compass needles near magnetic ore deposits. These are the people who keep me busy. It started on a Tuesday morning when the Hartwell family failed to check out of their backcountry permit on schedule. David Hartwell, 42, his wife Linda, 38, and their 2 children, Michael, 16, and Sarah, 12, had registered for a 5-day wilderness camping experience along the Quinaul River Trail system. They were experienced hikers from Portland, the kind of family that knew to file detailed itineraries and carry proper emergency equipment. When they didn't show up at the ranger station by 10 a.m. on Monday, we initiated standard missing persons protocols. By Tuesday morning, we had deployed 2 search teams and called in additional support from surrounding districts. The weather had been perfect: clear skies, mild temperatures, no storms or flash flood risks. Their planned route was well marked and relatively straightforward. Everything about this case should have been routine. I was leading Team Alpha, working our way up the north branch of their intended route, when we found their first campsite. The scene was unsettling. Their tent was still standing, properly staked and undamaged. Sleeping bags were laid out as if they'd been preparing for bed. A camp stove sat on a flat rock with a pot still attached, containing what looked like the remains of instant oatmeal. But there were no people, no signs of struggle, no indication of where they'd gone or why they'd left everything behind. "This doesn't make sense," muttered Carlos Santos, my partner for the past 3 years. Carlos was a former Marine who'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the Forest Service. He wasn't easily rattled. Nobody leaves their gear like this, especially not with kids. I walked the perimeter of the campsite, looking for tracks, disturbed vegetation, anything that might indicate direction of travel. The ground was soft from recent rain, perfect for preserving footprints. I found the family's tracks leading into the campsite from the main trail, but I couldn't find any leading out. It was as if they'd simply vanished from inside their own camp. "Thomas," Carlos called from the far side of the site. "You need to see this." He was standing near a massive Douglas fir, pointing up at the trunk about 8 feet above ground level. Carved into the bark were 4 parallel gashes, each about 6 inches long and deep enough to expose the pale wood underneath. The cuts looked fresh, sap was still weeping from the wounds. "Bear?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Carlos shook his head. "Wrong pattern. Bear claws would be more random. Different depth. These are too uniform, too deliberate." He paused, studying the marks more carefully. "And too high. Even a big black bear would have trouble reaching this height while standing on its hind legs." We photographed everything and called in our findings to base camp. The official response was predictable: expand the search radius, deploy additional teams, notify local law enforcement. Standard operating procedure for a missing family. But as we prepared to move deeper into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were dealing with something far from standard. The afternoon search turned up 2 more campsites, both similarly abandoned. Personal belongings left behind, no signs of struggle, no clear direction of departure. At the 3rd site, we found something that made my skin crawl. Children's drawings scattered around a dead campfire. Sarah Hartwell had been sketching in a small notebook, innocent pictures of trees, mountains, and wildlife. But the last few pages showed something else entirely. The drawings were crude but unmistakable. A large, humanoid figure standing among trees. It was covered in dark fur or hair, with disproportionately long arms and a face that was barely human. In one drawing, the figure was watching a small tent from behind a cluster of trees. In another, it appeared to be gesturing toward the tent as if beckoning. At the bottom of the last page, in a child's careful handwriting, were the words, "He wants us to follow." Carlos and I exchanged glances. Neither of us spoke, but we were thinking the same thing. In 15 years of search and rescue work, I'd learned to trust my instincts. And my instincts were screaming that this family hadn't just gotten lost. As afternoon stretched into evening, we made the decision to establish our own base camp and continue the search at first light. The forest was beginning to settle into its nightly rhythm. The day birds giving way to owls, small animals rustling through the underbrush, the distant splash of something moving through the river. Normal sounds that should have been comforting but somehow felt ominous in light of what we'd discovered. I was setting up my sleeping bag when I heard the first whistle. It was low and melodic, almost like a bird call, but with an unmistakably human quality. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions at once, echoing off the trees in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. Carlos looked up from his gear, his expression alert. "You hear that?" he asked quietly. I nodded, straining to listen. The whistling continued for several minutes, a haunting melody that seemed to move through the forest around our camp. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No nightbirds, no rustling leaves, no river sounds. Just an oppressive quiet that pressed against my eardrums like physical weight. We sat in that silence for what felt like hours, though my watch showed only 20 minutes had passed. When the normal forest sounds finally resumed, I realized I'd been holding my breath. "We should radio this in," Carlos suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Radio what in?" I replied. "That we heard whistling in the woods?" He didn't answer, but I could see in his eyes the same reluctance I felt. How do you report something that sounds like the beginning of a ghost story? How do you tell your supervisors that a routine missing persons case is starting to feel like something out of a nightmare? That night, I lay in my sleeping bag staring up at the canopy, unable to shake the image of those children's drawings. The figure in the sketches had been watching, waiting, beckoning. And somewhere out there in the darkness, the Hartwell family was either still following whatever they'd seen or they were beyond our help entirely. The last thing I remembered before finally drifting off was the sound of that whistling, distant but unmistakable. drifting through the trees like a lullaby sung by something that had never been human. I woke before dawn to the sound of Carlos moving around our camp. The fire had died to barely glowing embers, and the pre-dawn air carried the kind of chill that penetrates straight through sleeping bags and thermal layers. My watch read 4:47 a.m. Couldn't sleep either? I asked, sitting up and immediately regretting it as cold air hit my face. Been awake since about 3, Carlos replied, stirring the coals and adding kindling. Kept hearing things moving around out there, probably just deer or elk, but he trailed off, but I understood. After what we'd seen yesterday, every normal forest sound seemed loaded with potential threat. We broke camp quickly and resumed our search at first light. The plan was to follow the river upstream, checking for any signs that the Hartwells had continued in that direction. But as we picked our way along the rocky bank, I found myself thinking about the whistling we'd heard the night before and about Sarah's drawings of the watching figure. It was Carlos who spotted the footprint. Thomas, he called, crouched near a muddy section of riverbank about a quarter mile from our overnight camp. You need to see this. The print was enormous, easily 18 inches long and proportionally wide, with clearly defined toe impressions. It was pressed deep into the soft mud, indicating significant weight. More disturbing were the accompanying prints. 4 sets of human footprints, including 2 that were clearly children's sizes, leading directly toward the giant track. This doesn't make sense, Carlos muttered, taking photographs from multiple angles. This looks like they were following it. Voluntarily, I studied the track carefully. The depth and clarity were too perfect for a hoax, and we were miles from any established trail. But more than that, something about the print itself seemed wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. It looked human but not human, familiar but alien. We need to call this in, I said, reaching for my radio. Base camp, this is Team Alpha. We found tracks indicating the missing family may be following an unknown individual. Request additional resources and possibly state police involvement. The response crackled through with typical bureaucratic efficiency. Copy, Team Alpha. Document everything and continue tracking. Additional teams en route to your position. What I didn't report was the growing certainty that whatever had left that enormous footprint wasn't human. And I definitely didn't mention the way the normal forest sounds seemed to die whenever we got close to the tracks. We followed the trail for another hour, finding more prints at regular intervals. The pattern never varied. The large non-human track leading, the family's prints following behind. No signs of coercion, no evidence of struggle. Just a family walking voluntarily deeper into the wilderness, following something that shouldn't exist. It was around noon when we encountered Joseph Crowfeather. I heard him before I saw him, the soft sound of footsteps on forest floor, approaching from downstream. Carlos and I both drew our weapons, not knowing what to expect. When the figure emerged from between the trees, I was surprised to see an elderly Native American man, probably in his 70s, carrying a traditional walking stick and wearing modern hiking clothes. You boys look like you could use some help, he said, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that comes from decades spent in the wilderness. I'm Ranger Mitchell. This is Ranger Santos, I replied, lowering my weapon but not holstering it. Are you registered for backcountry camping? This is a restricted search area. The old man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Joseph Crowfeather, tribal council member for the Quinault Nation. And I'm here because of what you're tracking. Something in his tone made me take a step back. What do you know about our missing persons case? I know you're following sign that shouldn't be followed, he replied, moving closer to examine the tracks we'd been studying. I know your missing family heard the calling whistle 3 nights ago and chose to answer it. And I know that if you keep following this trail, you're going to find more than you bargained for. Carlos and I exchanged glances. Mr. Crowfeather, I said carefully, we're conducting an official search and rescue operation. If you have information relevant to this case, I need you to share it with us formally. Joseph laughed, but there was no humor in it. Formally? Boy, your formal training doesn't have words for what you're dealing with. He gestured toward the massive footprint. Your people call him Bigfoot, Sasquatch. We call him Saskets, the guardian of deep places. He's been in these forests longer than our stories remember. Sir, with respect, we're looking for a missing family, not chasing cryptozoology theories, Carlos interjected. Are you? Joseph replied, fixing him with a steady stare. Because those tracks tell a different story. They tell the story of a family that was chosen, called, invited to follow. The question you should be asking isn't where they went, it's why the Saskets wanted them to come. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. What do you mean, chosen? Joseph knelt beside the tracks, running his fingers along the edge of the giant footprint. The old stories say that sometimes the guardian calls to certain people, usually when the balance is threatened, when the forest needs protecting from something worse than human intrusion. He looked up at us with grave eyes. 3 days ago, our tribal elders felt a disturbance in the forest. Something was wrong, something was coming that doesn't belong here. The Saskets doesn't usually involve humans in guardian business, but sometimes. Sometimes what? I pressed. Sometimes he needs witnesses. People who can carry word back to your world about what they've seen. Joseph stood, brushing dirt from his hands. The question is whether your missing family was meant to be those witnesses, or whether they were meant to be something else entirely. The way he said something else made my stomach clench. What kind of disturbance are we talking about? Joseph was quiet for a long moment, studying our faces as if trying to decide how much to trust us. Finally, he spoke. 2 weeks ago, illegal logging equipment was found abandoned about 10 miles northeast of here. Commercial-grade stuff, the kind used for clear-cutting operations. But here's the strange part. The equipment looked like it had been destroyed. Deliberately. Expensive machinery worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, twisted and bent like someone with immense strength had taken it apart piece by piece. Vandalism? Carlos suggested. No, Joseph replied firmly. Vandalism leaves evidence, tool marks, explosive residue, tire tracks from vehicles used to access the site. This was different. This looked like something incredibly strong had simply torn the machines apart with its bare hands. I thought about the claw marks we'd found at the first campsite, too high and too uniform for any known animal. You think the Saskets destroyed the logging equipment? I think the Guardian protects what needs protecting, Joseph said diplomatically. And I think whoever was planning to use that equipment illegally in protected forest got a message they probably understood very clearly. But what does that have to do with the Hartwell family? I asked. Joseph's expression grew darker. Because the people who owned that equipment didn't get the message. According to our sources, they're planning to try again, but this time they're bringing additional security. The kind of people who hunt dangerous animals for trophy kills. The implications hit me like a physical blow. You're saying someone's coming here to hunt Bigfoot? I'm saying someone's coming here to hunt the guardian of these forests, Joseph corrected. And the Saskets knows it. The question is whether he called your missing family to witness what happens to those who threaten his domain, or whether he called them to warn them to stay away from what's coming. Carlos had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up. Mr. Crowfeather, assuming for a moment that we accept your interpretation of these events, what would you advise us to do? Joseph looked at him with something approaching respect. I'd advise you to remember that your job is search and rescue, not law enforcement. If you find your missing family, get them out of these woods as quickly as possible. Don't ask questions, don't try to understand what they've seen, just get them to safety. And if we encounter the Saskets ourselves? I asked. Show respect, Joseph replied immediately. Don't approach, don't threaten, don't try to capture or document. The Guardian has allowed you to follow this far because you're trying to help people he's protecting. But if he decides you're a threat, he gestured toward the massive footprint. Well, you've seen what he's capable of. We spent another hour with Joseph, learning about traditional stories and protocols for dealing with what he called forest spirits. Much of it sounded like folklore, but there were practical elements that made sense. How to move through the woods without disturbing natural patterns. What sounds to listen for that might indicate non-human presence. How to recognize territorial markers that meant stay away. Before he left, Joseph gave us each a small carved pendant, traditional Quinault symbols that he said would identify us as friends of the forest to any spirits we might encounter. I wanted to dismiss it as superstition, but after everything we'd seen, I wasn't taking any chances. As we watched him disappear back into the forest with the kind of silent grace that only comes from a lifetime in the wilderness, Carlos turned to me with a grim expression. So, he said, we're either dealing with a missing family who encountered an undiscovered species of North American primate, or we're dealing with a missing family who encountered something that's been living in these forests for thousands of years and doesn't appreciate modern civilization encroaching on its territory. When you put it like that, I replied, checking my equipment and preparing to continue our search. I'm not sure which option I prefer. We resumed following the tracks, but now every shadow between the trees seemed potentially significant. Every distant sound potentially meaningful. The forest around us was beautiful and ancient and utterly indifferent to human concerns, and somewhere ahead, the Hartwell family was either experiencing the adventure of a lifetime or walking towards something that would fundamentally change their understanding of what was possible in the world. Either way, we were going to find them. The tracks led us deeper into the forest than any established trail had reason to go. By mid-afternoon, we were in what the maps designated as pristine wilderness area, sections of the Olympic Peninsula that had never been logged, never been developed, barely even been explored by modern humans. The trees here were ancient giants, Douglas firs and western red cedars that had been growing since before Columbus reached the Americas. It was in this cathedral of living wood that we found them. Jesus Christ, Carlos whispered, stopping so abruptly that I nearly walked into him. Ahead of us, in a circular clearing perhaps 50 yards across, the Hartwell family sat around a cold fire pit. They were alive, apparently unharmed, but something about the scene was deeply wrong. They sat perfectly still, facing outward from the circle like sentries on guard duty. They didn't move when we approached, didn't acknowledge our presence, didn't respond when we called their names. David Hartwell, I called, moving closer cautiously. This is the Forest Service. We're here to help you. No response. David's eyes were open, staring fixedly at the tree line, but he showed no sign of hearing me. His wife Linda sat beside him in the same unnatural stillness, and the children, God, the children were the worst part. 16-year-old Michael and 12-year-old Sarah sat motionless with the same empty stare as their parents, like living mannequins arranged in a tableau. Are they drugged? Carlos asked, approaching Linda's position from the other side. I knelt next to David, checking his pulse and breathing. Both were normal, though his skin felt unusually warm to the touch. His eyes tracked movement. When I waved my hand in front of his face, his pupils followed the motion. But he showed no other signs of consciousness. Pupils are responsive, I reported. Breathing and pulse normal, no obvious signs of injury or illness. I tried again. David, can you hear me? We're here to take you home. Still nothing. It was Sarah who finally moved. Slowly, mechanically, her head turned toward me. When she spoke, her voice was flat and emotionless, like someone reciting memorized lines. He's coming back soon, she said. We have to wait here until he comes back. Who's coming back, Sarah? I asked gently. Who told you to wait here? The Guardian, she replied in that same lifeless tone. He went to deal with the bad men. He said to wait here until he comes back, and then he'll show us the way home. Carlos and I exchanged glances over the girl's head. Sarah, how long have you been here? I asked. 3 days, Michael answered, his head turning toward us with the same mechanical movement as his sister's. Or maybe 4. Time feels different here. Are you hurt? Are you hungry? Do you need water? The questions tumbled out as my training kicked in. We don't need anything, Linda said, speaking for the first time. The Guardian provides for us. He brings water from the clean stream and food from the forest. He keeps us safe from the bad men. What bad men? Carlos asked sharply. David's head turned toward us then, and when he spoke, it was with the same flat affect as the rest of his family. The men with guns who want to hurt the Guardian. The men who destroyed his trees and poisoned his streams. He's teaching them that some things shouldn't be hunted. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Joseph Crowfeather's warnings about illegal loggers and trophy hunters suddenly felt a lot more real and immediate. David, we need to get you and your family back to civilization, I said firmly. Can you walk? Can you carry the children if necessary? We can't leave, Sarah said, her voice carrying an odd finality. Not until the Guardian comes back. He's protecting us, but he's also... He needs us here. Needs you for what? I pressed. Before anyone could answer, the forest around us fell silent. Not the gradual quieting that comes with dusk, but an immediate, absolute cessation of all sound. No bird calls, no insect buzzing, no wind through the leaves. Even our own breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself had thickened. Carlos grabbed my arm, his grip tight enough to hurt. Thomas, he whispered, look at the trees. I followed his gaze toward the edge of the clearing and felt my rational mind struggle to process what I was seeing. The shadows between the ancient trees were moving, shifting, and coalescing into a shape that was almost human but impossibly large. As my eyes adjusted, the figure became more distinct, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown fur, with proportions that suggested immense strength. It stood perfectly still at the forest's edge, watching us with eyes that reflected what little sunlight penetrated the canopy. Nobody move, I whispered, though my hand instinctively went to the radio on my belt. The creature, the Soskets, if Joseph was right, tilted its head slightly, studying us with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware and calculating. When it stepped into the clearing, its movement was surprisingly graceful for something so large, almost silent despite its size. The Hartwell family reacted to its presence immediately. All four of them stood in perfect unison, turning toward the creature with expressions of, not fear but anticipation, like children waiting for a beloved teacher to begin an important lesson. "Guardian," Sarah said, her voice carrying more emotion than I'd heard from any of them since we'd arrived. "You're back." The creature, I was having trouble thinking of it as an it rather than a he, made a sound that was part rumble, part whistle, almost like whale song translated through a human throat. The Hartwell family nodded as if they understood perfectly. "He says the bad men are gone," David translated, though I hadn't heard anything resembling words in that sound. "He dealt with them. Now he can show us the way home." "What does that mean, he dealt with them?" Carlos asked, his voice tight with tension. The creature's attention shifted to us then, and I felt the full weight of its gaze. Up close, its features were more human than I'd expected, but still utterly alien. The face was elongated, with a prominent brow ridge and dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of intelligence and experience that made me feel like a child being evaluated by an adult. It made another sound, longer and more complex than the first. This time, young Michael served as translator. "He says the Forest Service Rangers are brave to follow so far to help lost people. He says most humans only enter the deep forest to take things, but you came to give help. Tell him we appreciate his protection of the family," I said carefully, feeling ridiculous for talking to what might be the most significant zoological discovery in human history as if it were a person. "But we need to escort them back to safety now." The creature listened to Michael's translation, though I had no idea how the boy was communicating with it, and then shook its massive head slowly. When it spoke again, its voice carried an unmistakable note of sadness. "He says the family has seen too much to go back unchanged," Linda translated. "They know about the Guardian now, and about the men who come to destroy sacred places. They have to choose whether to carry that knowledge back to warn others, or to forget and return to their old lives." "What kind of choice is that?" I demanded. The creature approached us then, moving with deliberate slowness that I hoped was meant to be non-threatening. When it was close enough that I could smell its musky, earthy scent, like rich soil and growing things and something wilder underneath, it knelt down to bring its face closer to our level. Up close, I could see that its eyes were not the simple dark pools they'd appeared from a distance. They held flecks of gold and green, and in them I saw something that made my breath catch. Recognition. This creature knew exactly what we were, understood our purpose here, and was trying to decide whether we could be trusted with the knowledge of its existence. When it spoke directly to me, I didn't need a translator. The meaning came through in gestures, in the cadence of its voice, in some form of communication that bypassed language entirely. "You seek to protect. I seek to protect. The forest has many threats, but the greatest threat is those who come with weapons and greed. Your people, your government, would they protect the Guardian, or would they study him like a specimen?" I found myself answering without conscious thought. "I don't know, but I know some who would protect, and some who would study, and some who would try to profit from the discovery." The creature nodded, somehow conveying both understanding and disappointment. "Then the family must choose, return with knowledge and risk bringing destruction, or return with silence and allow future destruction to proceed unopposed." "There has to be another option," Carlos said, and I realized he was following the conversation as clearly as I was. The creature considered this for a long moment. Then it stood, walked to the center of the clearing, and began to dig. Its massive hands moved earth and stone with ease, revealing what looked like a metal box buried perhaps 3 feet down. When it opened the container, I could see papers, photographs, and what looked like survey equipment. Evidence of the destroyer's plans, came the wordless communication. Proof of intended crimes against protected land. Given to the right people, this could stop the immediate threat without revealing the Guardian's existence. I understood. The creature was offering us a compromise, evidence to prosecute the illegal loggers and hunters in exchange for keeping its existence secret. The Hartwell family would return with vague memories of getting lost and being helped by a reclusive local, nothing that would bring scientific expeditions or trophy hunters into the deep forest. "And if we agree to this?" I asked. The creature looked at each member of the Hartwell family in turn, then back at us. "They go home safely. You go home safely. The forest remains protected. The Guardian watches over sacred places as he has for 1,000 years." It was Carlos who voiced what we were both thinking. And if we don't agree, the creature's expression didn't change, but somehow its presence seemed to fill the clearing, reminding us of exactly how isolated we were and how easily our own disappearance could be explained as a tragic accident during a search and rescue operation. The Guardian hopes that won't be necessary. I looked at the Hartwell family, standing in their circle with expressions of patient expectation, and realized that we'd just been offered a choice that would define not only our own futures but potentially the future of one of the last great mysteries on Earth. The question was, which choice could we live with? The decision was made for us by the sound of helicopters. We heard them long before we saw them. The distinctive whoop 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 of rotor blades cutting through the mountain air, growing steadily louder as they approached our position. The creature's head snapped up immediately, its entire body tensing with alert weariness. "Official search and rescue?" Carlos asked hopefully. I was already reaching for my radio. "Base camp, this is Team Alpha. Do you have aircraft in our sector?" The response crackled back with ominous clarity. "Negative, Team Alpha. All our birds are grounded due to mechanical issues. Repeat, we have no aircraft in your area." The Saskets made a sound unlike anything I'd heard from it before. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to emanate from deep in its chest. The Hartwell family immediately moved closer together, their strange trance-like calm replaced by obvious fear. "Guardian says the bad men found us," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "He says they brought flying machines and weapons that hurt from far away." Through the canopy, I caught glimpses of 2 helicopters circling our position. Sleek, black aircraft that definitely weren't Forest Service equipment. As they descended toward a clearing about half a mile away, I could see figures rappelling down ropes, armed figures in tactical gear. "Thomas," Carlos said urgently, "we need to get everyone out of here, now." The creature moved with sudden purpose, gathering up the metal box of evidence and securing it in what looked like a natural pack made from woven plant fibers. Then it turned to us, and the communication was crystal clear. "The destroyers have found the sacred place. They come with weapons and capture tools. You must take your people to safety while the Guardian deals with this threat." "We're not leaving you to face armed men alone," I protested. The creature's expression, if it could be called an expression, conveyed something that might have been appreciation, but also firm resolve. "This is Guardian business. Your job is to protect these people. The Guardian's job is to protect the forest." "David, Linda, kids," I called urgently. "We need to move, right now. Stay close, stay quiet, and do exactly what we tell you." The family responded immediately, their protective instincts overriding whatever influence had kept them passive earlier. David scooped up their remaining gear while Linda gathered the children. They moved with the kind of focused efficiency that comes from real fear. We were just reaching the edge of the clearing when the first shot rang out. The sound echoed through the forest like thunder, followed immediately by shouting voices that carried clearly in the still air. "Contact! Target acquired in Grid 77 Alpha. Do not engage unless fired upon. Repeat, capture alive if possible. Negative, we have authorization for lethal force if the target presents immediate threat." The creature had vanished into the forest with that supernatural stealth that 8-foot, 500-pound beings shouldn't possess. But the fact that the hunters were already shooting meant they'd seen something worth shooting at. "This way," I whispered, leading our group along a deer path that headed generally downhill toward the river. "Stay low, watch your footing, and if anyone gets separated, follow the water downstream until you reach the main trail." We moved as quickly as we dared through the thick undergrowth, the children keeping pace better than I'd expected. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, more gunshots, mechanical sounds I couldn't identify, and occasionally the roar of helicopter engines as the aircraft repositioned. It was young Michael who spotted the first trap. "Wait," he whispered urgently, grabbing my arm as I started to step over what looked like a fallen log. The Guardian showed us about those. Looking closer, I could see thin wires stretched between trees at ankle height, nearly invisible in the dappled forest light. Camera traps, motion sensors, or possibly something worse. "They've been preparing for this," Carlos muttered. "This isn't some spur-of-the-moment hunting expedition." We detoured around the trapped area, but it cost us time and forced us deeper into terrain I didn't recognize. The sounds behind us were getting closer, and I was starting to realize that we weren't just witnesses to a confrontation between cryptozoology enthusiasts and their quarry. This was a coordinated military-style operation with serious funding and professional personnel. The question was, who was funding it? And what did they really want with the creature? We found partial answers when we stumbled across their base camp. It was a sophisticated operation set up in a natural depression about a mile from where we'd encountered the Saskets. Military-grade tents, communication equipment, banks of computers and monitoring devices, and enough weaponry to outfit a small army. But what caught my attention were the cages. 3 large transport cages, each big enough to hold a creature the size of what we'd just met. They were labeled with corporate logos I didn't recognize and shipping addresses to facilities in 3 different states. Jesus, Carlos breathed. They're planning to capture it alive. Multiple specimens, I corrected, studying the setup more carefully. They think there's more than one. Sarah tugged at my sleeve. There are more, she whispered. The Guardian has a family, a mate and children who live in the deep caves. That's why he's so angry about the bad men. The implications were staggering. If the creature we'd met was protecting not just territory but family, his willingness to confront armed humans made perfect sense. And if these hunters knew about other individuals, a burst of automatic weapons fire echoed through the forest, much closer than before. It was answered immediately by a sound I'd never heard before, a roar of pure rage that seemed to shake the trees themselves. We need to get out of here, I said urgently. Now. But as we turned to leave the camp, we found ourselves facing 3 armed figures in tactical gear. They'd approached with professional silence, and now their weapons were trained directly on us. Forest Service? The lead figure asked, his voice muffled by a tactical mask. That's right, I replied, keeping my hands visible and hoping my voice sounded steadier than I felt. I'm Ranger Mitchell. This is Ranger Santos. We're conducting a search and rescue operation for this family. Well, that's convenient, the man replied, because you're all coming with us. On whose authority? Carlos demanded. On the authority of people who pay better than the government and ask fewer questions, came the reply. We need witnesses to confirm our acquisition, and you'll do nicely. The casual way he said acquisition made my blood run cold. These people weren't just hunting the creature, they were planning to capture it for sale to the highest bidder. The cages, the shipping labels, the professional military equipment all suddenly made horrible sense. You can't just abduct federal officers, I protested. We can't leave witnesses to an operation this sensitive, the man corrected. But we're not unreasonable. Cooperate. Sign the appropriate non-disclosure agreements, and everyone gets to go home with a nice bonus in their bank accounts. And if we don't cooperate? Linda asked, her voice tight with fear. The man shrugged. Well, the forest is a dangerous place. Lots of ways people can have accidents, especially during unstable weather conditions. Another burst of gunfire echoed through the trees, followed by the crash of something large moving through the forest at high speed. The tactical team leader spoke into his radio. Bravo team, status report. The response was nearly incoherent through static and what sounded like screaming. Target is multiple contacts. Jesus Christ, it's fast. Need immediate backup. The radio went silent. Charlie team, respond, the leader called. Echo team, what's your position? More silence. For the first time since we'd encountered them, the armed figures showed signs of nervousness. Their weapons were still trained on us, but their attention was clearly divided between us and whatever was happening deeper in the forest. That was when the trees started falling. The sound was unmistakable, the crack and crash of large trees being deliberately toppled, forming barriers and obstacles. It was happening all around us, a circle of destruction that was clearly moving inward toward the base camp. What the hell is that thing doing? One of the tactical team muttered. I was beginning to understand. The creature wasn't just defending itself. It was systematically destroying the hunter's ability to escape, blocking helicopter landing zones, creating impassable barriers, turning the hunter's sophisticated equipment against them by making the terrain too unstable for vehicles or aircraft. It's teaching you the same lesson it taught the illegal loggers, I said quietly. Some things shouldn't be hunted. The team leader turned back toward us, and I could see fear in his eyes despite the tactical mask. What do you know about this thing? I know it's been protecting these forests for longer than your civilization has existed, I replied. And I know it's not going to let you destroy its family. A sound split the air then that made every human in the clearing freeze. A call that was part roar, part whistle, part something I had no words for. But its meaning was unmistakable. A challenge, a warning, and a promise of what would happen to anyone who threatened what the creature protected. In the silence that followed, I heard something else. The sound of helicopters starting up, trying to take off in a hurry. The hunters were retreating. The question was whether they'd be allowed to leave. The sounds of retreat grew distant as the remaining hunters abandoned their equipment and fled through the forest. Within an hour, the only evidence of their presence was the base camp full of abandoned gear and the occasional helicopter engine fading toward the horizon. We waited in the camp until the forest sounds returned to normal, then cautiously made our way back toward the clearing where we'd first encountered the Saskets. The creature was waiting for us, sitting calmly beside the cold fire pit as if nothing had happened. but I noticed that its fur was singed in several places, and there were what looked like bullet grazes along its left arm. "Are you hurt?" Sarah asked immediately, running toward the creature with the kind of concern a child might show for an injured pet. The creature made a soft rumbling sound and gently touched the girl's head with one massive finger. Through whatever method of communication it used, the meaning was clear. "The Guardian has dealt with worse. The wounds will heal." "What happened to the hunters?" Carlos asked. "They learned that some prey hunts back," came the response. "They will not return to this forest. Their employers will find other projects to fund." "You let them go?" I was surprised. After seeing the evidence of their operation, I had expected a more permanent resolution. The creature's expression conveyed something like patience with a slow student. "The Guardian protects. He does not murder. Fear is a better teacher than death. The survivors will spread word that these mountains are dangerous for those who come with evil intentions." It was a lesson in restraint that I found both admirable and slightly terrifying. This being had just single-handedly defeated a well-armed military operation, but had chosen education over elimination. "The evidence," I said, gesturing toward the metal box the creature still carried. "What happens to that now?" "That depends on the choice you make," the creature replied. "The proof of crimes can be given to those who enforce your laws, but doing so will raise questions about how it was obtained. Questions that might lead others back to this place." I understood the dilemma. The evidence could stop future illegal operations, but using it might eventually lead to scientific expeditions that would be just as disruptive to the creature's privacy as the hunters had been. "There might be another way," David said suddenly. He'd been quiet since the confrontation with the hunters, but now he spoke with the calm certainty of someone who'd reached an important decision. "The hiking community is pretty tight-knit," he continued, "especially the serious backcountry people. If word got out that this area was being used for illegal hunting operations, that there were active traps and dangerous people with military weapons, well, legitimate hikers would avoid the area, and any future illegal operations would have to deal with the fact that everyone knew to watch for suspicious activity." "You're suggesting we warn people about the hunters without mentioning the Guardian?" Linda asked. "I'm suggesting we tell the truth," David replied. "Most of it, anyway. We got lost. We encountered evidence of illegal activity. We were briefly held by armed individuals who fled when confronted by park authorities. All technically true." The creature listened to this exchange with obvious interest. When David finished, it tilted its head in what I was learning to recognize as a gesture of consideration. "The partial truth serves both purposes," it finally communicated. "Your people learn of danger without learning of guardians. Future threats become more difficult because watchers expect them." "What about the evidence of the logging operation?" Carlos asked. "That evidence can be discovered by rangers conducting follow-up investigations in the area where equipment was found," the creature replied. "No questions about how deep forest secrets were obtained." I realized what it was suggesting. We could return with a story about encountering illegal hunters, triggering an official investigation that would discover the evidence of the logging operation. The abandoned hunter base camp would support our story about armed individuals, and the bureaucratic machinery would grind forward to prosecute the real crimes without ever learning about the extraordinary intelligence that had orchestrated the whole thing. "There's just one problem," I said. "What happens the next time someone comes looking for you? Because after today there are going to be people who know something unusual happened here. Some of them are going to keep digging." The creature stood and walked to the edge of the clearing, gazing out into the forest that was its domain. When it responded, the communication carried overtones of sadness and resignation. "The Guardian has lived hidden for many generations. Each generation of humans grows more numerous, more curious, more capable of searching in deep places. Perhaps the time of hiding is ending." "But that doesn't have to be bad," Sarah said suddenly. "I mean, if people knew you were real, some of them would want to protect you, like whale sanctuaries or national parks, and others would want to study the Guardian, capture him, display him, sell pieces of him to those who believe in magic," came the reply. "Human curiosity is not always kind." It was a sobering reminder of how human contact might affect not just this individual creature, but potentially an entire hidden species. The responsibility of that knowledge was overwhelming. "What if?" Michael began hesitantly, then seemed to gather courage. "What if some people knew, but only the right people, like park rangers who already protect the forest, or scientists who study animals to help them instead of hurt them?" The creature turned its attention to the boy with what might have been surprise. "The young one suggests controlled revelation rather than complete secrecy or complete exposure." "It could work," I found myself saying. A small group of trusted individuals, rangers, conservationists, maybe a few scientists who've proven they can keep secrets when necessary. People who understand that some discoveries are too important to be left to chance. And who decides which humans can be trusted with such knowledge? The creature asked. You do, Linda said simply. You watch them, the way you watched us. You learn who comes to the forest to take and who comes to give. Over time, you choose the ones who earn the right to know. The elegance of the solution struck me immediately. Rather than hiding completely or revealing everything, the creature could gradually build a network of human allies, people who knew the truth and could help protect it from those who would exploit it. A conspiracy of protection rather than a conspiracy of exploitation, the creature mused. Guardians among the humans to work with the guardian of the forest. It's been done before, Carlos pointed out. There are places all over the world where local communities protect wildlife from poachers and researchers. Places where everyone agrees that some secrets are worth keeping. The creature was quiet for a long time, considering the implications. Finally, it reached into its pack and withdrew the metal box of evidence, holding it out toward me. The first test of this alliance, it communicated. Take this evidence, use it to stop the immediate threats. If the Guardian's new allies prove trustworthy, perhaps other evidence will follow. Other knowledge, other cooperation. I took the box with hands that were steadier than I'd expected. The weight of it seemed disproportionate to its size, not just the weight of metal and paper but the weight of responsibility for decisions that could affect the course of history. What happens now? I asked. Now you return to your world and decide what kind of allies you choose to be, the creature replied. The Guardian will watch and learn whether humans can truly protect what they claim to value. As we prepared to leave the clearing, the Hartwell family said their goodbyes to the creature with obvious reluctance. It had been their protector, their teacher, their guide, through an experience that would probably define the rest of their lives. The creature seemed equally reluctant to see them go, touching each of them gently with the care a parent might show for children embarking on a dangerous journey. Remember the lessons of the deep forest, it told them. Some things are worth protecting, some secrets are worth keeping, some responsibilities are too important to ignore. As we made our way back toward civilization, I found myself thinking about Joseph Crow Feather's warnings about the balance between human curiosity and respect for the unknown. We were carrying back to the world knowledge that could change everything or destroy everything, depending on how wisely it was used. The question that would define our futures, and possibly the future of an entire species, was whether we could find people who shared the creature's understanding that true guardianship meant protecting things, whether or not you could profit from them. Behind us, the ancient forest closed around the clearing where something extraordinary continued its patient watch over the deep places of the world. And ahead of us lay the challenge of proving that humans could be worthy of the trust that had been placed in us. Some secrets, I was learning, were heavier than others. But some secrets were also more important than anything else we might choose to do with the rest of our lives. 6 months later, the official report was a masterpiece of selective truth-telling. The Hartwell family had indeed been found safe after becoming disoriented in unmarked wilderness areas. Evidence of illegal logging operations had been discovered during follow-up investigations, leading to federal prosecutions of a shell company with ties to overseas timber interests. Reports of armed individuals conducting unauthorized activities in protected forest areas had triggered increased security patrols and camera installations. What the report didn't mention was the small but growing network of park rangers, conservation scientists, and tribal council members who now carried carved pendants and kept certain radio frequencies clear for communications they never officially received. The network operated on principles that Joseph Crow Feather had helped us establish: observe, protect, and above all, respect the intelligence of what we were protecting. Members were chosen carefully, tested over months of interactions that seemed casual but were actually careful evaluations of trustworthiness. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a conservation biologist who'd spent 20 years studying endangered primates, was the first scientist we recruited. She'd proven her discretion by successfully protecting populations of mountain gorillas from both poachers and overzealous researchers. When we finally told her what we'd found in the Olympic Peninsula, her response was immediate. "How can I help?" Marcus Thompson, a Quinault tribal elder and Joseph's nephew, brought traditional knowledge and diplomatic skills that proved invaluable when we began expanding to other forests. Apparently, the Olympic Peninsula wasn't the only place where similar guardians lived in carefully maintained secrecy. The network now included 12 individuals across 6 states, all bound by the understanding that we were protectors of something more important than our careers, our scientific curiosity, or our desire for recognition. We shared information about illegal activities, coordinated responses to potential threats, and served as a buffer between the Guardians and the broader human world. The evidence the creature had given us proved to be the beginning of a much larger trove of intelligence. Gradually, through means we never questioned, additional evidence appeared at predetermined locations. Information about illegal wildlife trafficking operations, unauthorized research activities, environmental crimes that no conventional law enforcement agency could have detected. It was as if we'd been recruited as the public face of a much more extensive intelligence network. Some nights, alone in my ranger station, I wondered about the true scope of what we'd stumbled into. How many Guardians were out there? How long had they been watching human activity? What other alliances existed between the world of hidden intelligence and the world of official protection? But mostly, I felt privileged to be part of something that transcended the usual boundaries between human civilization and wild nature. We were proof that cooperation was possible, that respect could be mutual, that protection could flow in both directions. The forest around my station felt different now. Not threatening or alien, but aware, engaged. Sometimes, on clear nights when the moon was full, I heard distant calls that might have been owls or might have been something else entirely. Communications in a language I didn't understand but somehow felt part of. The Hartwell family had returned to their normal lives, but they kept in touch. Sarah's drawings had evolved from simple forest scenes to complex illustrations that captured the delicate balance between human and natural worlds. Michael had changed his college plans to environmental science. David and Linda had become quiet but effective advocates for wilderness protection, funding and supporting conservation efforts without ever explaining their passionate commitment to preserving undisturbed habitat. They'd chosen to carry the knowledge rather than forget it, and it had changed their understanding of what was possible in the world, just as it had changed mine. 6 months ago, I'd been a park ranger doing a job I loved in places I respected. Now I was a guardian working with guardians, part of a network that stretched back through generations of forest wisdom and forward toward a future where cooperation might actually be possible. Some secrets I'd learned weren't meant to be kept forever. They were meant to be shared with exactly the right people at exactly the right time. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very careful, those people turned out to be worthy of the trust placed in them. The guardian was still out there, still watching, still protecting. But now he wasn't watching alone, and neither were we. I know this story probably sounds false, but hear me out. If you've ever been to Crater Lake National Park in southern Oregon, you've probably come across some strange, UFO-esque type things. Maybe you've heard of Bigfoot. Maybe you've heard of strange lights and UFOs. The October rain hammered against the windows of the ranger station with a persistence that matched my frustration. I'd been working alongside Tom Mitchell for nearly 3 years, ever since I transferred to the Crater Lake District, and I'd never seen a man carry such weight in his silence. Sure, we all had our stories, encounters with wildlife, close calls on the trails, the occasional tourist who wandered off path and needed rescuing. But Tom's silence was different. It was the kind of quiet that sits heavy in your chest, that makes you feel like you're standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable. The park itself seemed designed for secrets. Crater Lake sits atop Mount Mazama, part of the Cascade Range, formed nearly 8,000 years ago when the mountain collapsed during a massive volcanic eruption. The lake is 1,949 feet deep at its deepest point, making it the deepest lake in the United States. When you stand at the rim on a clear day, looking down at those impossibly blue waters, you understand why the Klamath, Modoc, and Yahuskin tribes regarded it as a site of power and danger, believing it served as a gateway between Earth and the underworld. But it wasn't just the indigenous legends that gave me pause. The area has been a hotspot for reported paranormal activity, UFO sightings, mysterious disappearances, strange lights, and yes, Bigfoot encounters. Most rangers learn to laugh off the tourist reports, the blurry photos, the breathless accounts of something large and hairy disappearing into the tree line. It comes with the territory. Tom never laughed. I first noticed it during my second week on the job. We were patrolling the North Rim Drive, checking on the condition of the trails after an early snowfall. The conversation had turned, as it often did among park staff, to the more unusual visitor reports we'd fielded that summer. Remember that family from Portland who swore they saw lights dancing over the lake? I'd said, trying to lighten the mood. Dad was convinced it was aliens. Kids were terrified. My partner from the previous district would have chuckled, maybe shared his own story about conspiracy theorists and amateur cryptozoologists. Tom just tightened his grip on the steering wheel and stared straight ahead. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. You ever see anything out here you couldn't explain? I asked. He'd turned to look at me then, and I saw something flicker across his face. Not annoyance or dismissal, but something closer to fear. Best to keep your eyes on the trail, he'd said finally. This place has a way of showing you things that aren't meant to be seen. That was the first of many conversations that ended before they really began. Over the months that followed, I learned to read the signs. When reports came in about strange sounds echoing from the forests around the park's 90 miles of trails, Tom would volunteer to investigate alone. When hikers mentioned feeling watched while camping near the remote backcountry sites, he'd take those calls too, and he'd always come back quiet, more withdrawn than before. The thing about Crater Lake that most visitors don't understand is its sheer isolation. Due to its short open season, the park averages just over 500,000 visitors every year, with most coming between July and September. But for the rest of the year, especially during the harsh winters when snow falls more often here than at any other long-term weather station in Oregon, the park becomes something altogether different. The tourist crowds disappear, the comfortable daylight hours shrink, and you're left with nothing but miles of trails and unmatched views, and whatever else might be moving through those ancient forests. Tom had been working the park for 15 years when I arrived, longer than any other ranger in the district. He knew every trail, every overlook, every hidden corner of the Caldera Rim. He could navigate the backcountry in conditions that would leave newer rangers hopelessly lost. But there was something about the night shifts that changed him. He never complained about pulling overnight patrol duty, never tried to trade shifts like the rest of us did. He seemed almost compelled to take them. Someone needs to keep an eye on things when the sun goes down, he'd say when pressed about it. That's when the park shows its true nature. I began to suspect that Tom's dedication to night patrol wasn't about duty or even preference. It was about something he'd seen, something that had marked him in a way that left him feeling responsible for standing watch. The other rangers had their theories, post-traumatic stress from a rescue gone wrong, maybe, or just the occupational hazard of spending too much time alone in the wilderness. But I'd worked with enough people over the years to recognize the difference between general anxiety and specific fear. Tom was afraid of something particular. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening in late September. We'd just finished processing a report from a group of backpackers who claimed they'd heard something large moving through the forest near their campsite at Mazama Village. The description was typical: heavy footsteps, branches breaking, an overwhelming sense of being observed by something that didn't belong. Tom had taken their statement with his usual professional detachment, but I noticed the way his hands trembled slightly as he wrote. After the backpackers left, I found him standing at the window, staring out at the parking lot where the first snow of the season was beginning to accumulate. "Tom," I said carefully, "how long has it been since you've taken any time off?" He didn't turn around. Time off for what? Rest, recovery, perspective. I moved to stand beside him. "You've been carrying something heavy for a while now. Maybe it's time to share the load." For a moment I thought he might open up. His shoulders sagged and I heard him draw a long, shaky breath, but then he straightened and the familiar mask of professional composure slipped back into place. "There's nothing to share," he said. "Just a job that needs doing." But as he walked away, I heard him mutter something under his breath that stopped me cold. 21 years this month. 21 years of wondering if it's still out there. That night, as I lay in my quarters listening to the wind howl across the Caldera Rim, I made a decision. Whatever Tom had encountered during his years at Crater Lake, whatever had left him standing perpetual guard against the darkness, I was going to find out. Not because I didn't trust his judgment, but because I'd seen what carrying that kind of secret alone could do to a person, and because, if I was being honest with myself, I was starting to hear things in the night that shouldn't have been there. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. 3 days after that conversation, we received a call about a missing hiker on the Pacific Crest Trail, somewhere between the Lightning Spring Trailhead and the North Junction. The weather was deteriorating rapidly. October in the Cascades can turn from crisp autumn to full winter in a matter of hours, and we had maybe 6 hours of searchable daylight left. Tom volunteered immediately, as I knew he would. But this time I insisted on partnering with him. "I know those trails as well as anyone," I argued when he tried to dissuade me. "2 sets of eyes are better than 1, especially with visibility dropping." He looked like he wanted to argue further, but protocol was on my side. We geared up in silence, checking our radios, headlamps, emergency supplies. The missing hiker was an experienced outdoorsman from Eugene, someone who knew the terrain and understood the risks. That made his disappearance even more concerning. As we drove toward the trailhead, I tried to draw Tom into conversation about the search pattern we'd use. the likely places someone might take shelter if they were injured or disoriented. He responded with professional efficiency, but I could feel his tension building as we climbed higher into the park's backcountry. Forests of mountain hemlock and Shasta red fir predominated near the caldera rim, where twisted whitebark pines testified to the harshness of the long winter. The trees seemed to close in around us as we followed the trail, their branches heavy with fresh snow that muffled our footsteps and created an eerie cathedral silence. We'd been searching for about 3 hours when we found our first real clue, a torn piece of fabric caught on a branch about 50 yards off the main trail. Tom examined it carefully, then looked around with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was seeing more than just trees and undergrowth. "He went this way," Tom said, pointing deeper into the forest. "But not by choice." "What do you mean?" Tom was already moving, following some trail I couldn't see. "The way the fabric tore, the angle of the branch, someone or something dragged him off the path." We followed Tom's lead through increasingly dense forest, calling the hiker's name and listening for any response. The snow was falling harder now, and I realized we were rapidly approaching the point where we'd need to call off the search until morning. That's when we found him. He was alive, conscious, and sitting with his back against a large Douglas fir about a quarter mile from where we'd found the fabric. But something was very wrong. As we approached, I could see that his eyes were wide with a kind of primal terror I'd never witnessed before. He was shivering uncontrollably, and not just from the cold. "Sir, are you injured?" I called out as we reached him. He turned toward my voice, but his gaze seemed to pass right through me. "It's still out there," he whispered. "It's been watching me. Waiting." Tom and I exchanged glances. Hypothermia could cause disorientation, hallucinations even. But something about the man's tone suggested he wasn't suffering from exposure-induced delusions. "What's been watching you?" Tom asked, and I was surprised by the gentleness in his voice. "I don't know what to call it," the hiker said. "I've been hiking these mountains for 20 years. I know what lives here. Bears, mountain lions, deer. This wasn't any of those things." He looked directly at Tom then, and I saw recognition flicker between them. "You've seen it too, haven't you?" Tom didn't answer immediately. He knelt beside the hiker, checking for signs of injury while I radioed for a medical evacuation. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept scanning the tree line around us. As we waited for the helicopter, the hiker told us what had happened. He'd been following the PCT south from Lightning Spring when he heard something paralleling his movement through the forest. At first he'd assumed it was a bear or elk, but the sounds were wrong, too deliberate, too intelligent. "It knew I was aware of it," he said. "So it started getting closer. I could smell it, this awful musky odor like wet fur and decay. And the breathing, God, the breathing was like nothing I've ever heard." "What did you see?" I asked. The hiker's eyes filled with tears. "It came out of the trees about 50 yards ahead of me, stood right in the middle of the trail like it owned the place. Had to be 8, maybe 9 feet tall, covered in dark hair, but the face," he shuddered. "The face was almost human. Almost. But the eyes were wrong. Too intelligent, too aware. And when it looked at me, I felt like it was seeing straight through to my soul." I glanced at Tom and saw that his face had gone completely pale. "It just stared at me for maybe 30 seconds, the hiker continued. "Then it made this sound, part growl, part something else, and it gestured, pointed off into the forest like it wanted me to follow. When I didn't move, it started walking toward me." "That's when you left the trail?" Tom asked. "I ran, crashed through the undergrowth like a panicked animal. Must have caught my jacket on that branch. When I finally stopped running, I was completely lost. I've been sitting here for hours, too scared to move because I can hear it out there. Moving through the trees, circling." The helicopter arrived just as darkness was settling over the forest. As the medical team prepared the hiker for transport, he grabbed Tom's arm. "You believe me, don't you?" he pleaded. "You've seen it." Tom looked into the man's eyes for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Yes," he said quietly. "I've seen it." After the helicopter disappeared into the night, Tom and I made our way back to the vehicle in silence. But as we reached the trailhead, I stopped. "Tom," I said, "we need to talk." He paused with his hand on the truck door. In the pale light from our headlamps, I could see that he was struggling with something. "Not here," he said finally. "Not in the open." We drove back to the ranger station without speaking, but as we pulled into the parking lot, Tom made a decision that changed everything between us. "Come to my place," he said. "If you really want to know what's out there, if you really want to understand why I take the night shifts, then come to my place. But once I tell you, you can't unknow it. and you can't pretend it's not real. I followed his truck through the winding roads that led to the small community where many of the park staff lived. Tom's house was a modest cabin tucked into a grove of old-growth fir trees, the kind of place that might seem cozy under normal circumstances. But as we walked to the front door, I noticed the heavy-duty locks, the reinforced window frames, the motion sensor lights that illuminated every approach to the building. Inside, Tom poured 2 glasses of whiskey and gestured for me to sit at his kitchen table. For several minutes, he just stared into his glass, gathering courage for whatever he was about to tell me. "That hiker," he said finally. His description, it matches what I saw in the year 2000, down to the smallest detail. "You're talking about Bigfoot," I said carefully. Tom laughed, but there was no humor in it. If only it were that simple. If it were just some unknown primate, some relic species that managed to survive in these mountains, I could handle that. But what I encountered that night, he took a long drink. What I encountered wasn't just an animal. It was something else entirely. "Tell me what happened." Tom set down his glass and looked directly at me. I'd been working night patrol, alone, during a shift that should have been routine. It was late October, a lot like tonight actually. Cold, snow starting to fall. I was checking the remote campgrounds, making sure everything was secure for the winter closure. He paused, and I could see him slipping back into that night, reliving details he'd probably tried to forget. "That's when I saw it," he continued, "and when it saw me, and when my life changed forever." Tom stood up abruptly and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness beyond the motion sensor lights. The whiskey had loosened something in him, but I could see that even 21 years later, talking about that night required every ounce of courage he possessed. "October 15th, 2000, he said without turning around. I remember the date because it's burned into my memory like a brand. I was 26 years old, still new enough to the job that I wanted to prove myself. When the opportunity came up to work a solo night patrol, I jumped at it." He returned to the table but remained standing, his hands gripping the back of his chair. "The assignment was simple enough. Drive the service roads through the backcountry areas, check on the remote facilities, make sure no one was camping illegally before the winter closure. Most of it was routine, the kind of work you can do on autopilot. But there was one stop that always made me uneasy." "Which one?" "The old research station near Lau Rock. It's about 2 miles off the main rim drive, accessible only by a narrow service road that winds through some of the densest forest in the park. The station had been abandoned for years, but we still had to check it periodically for signs of vandalism or unauthorized entry." Tom moved to a drawer and pulled out a detailed topographic map of the park, spreading it across the table. He pointed to an area on the north side of the caldera, where the contour lines clustered together to indicate steep terrain. "Here," he said. "The road ends at a small clearing where the research station sits. Forests of mountain hemlock and Shasta red fir predominate near the caldera rim, and they're thick enough that even during the day, very little sunlight reaches the ground. At night, with just your headlights and flashlight, it feels like you're driving into a cave." He traced the route with his finger, and I could see his hand trembling slightly. I'd made the drive dozens of times before, but that night felt different from the moment I turned off the main road. The temperature had dropped significantly. I could see my breath even inside the truck. And there was this smell. What kind of smell? Like something had died and been left to rot. But not just death. Something else mixed in. Something wild and musky and old. Really old. Tom sat down heavily. "I figured it was just a deer or elk carcass somewhere nearby. Maybe a bear kill." So I continued toward the station. He paused to take another drink, and I noticed that his eyes kept darting toward the windows. About halfway to the station, maybe a mile from the main road, my headlights picked up something moving through the trees. At first I thought it was a bear. The size was right, and the way it was moving, upright, but with that characteristic rolling gait. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. Wrong how? Bears don't walk perfectly upright for extended periods. They'll rear up to get a better look at something, maybe take a few steps on their hind legs, but then they drop back down. This thing was striding through the forest like a person, a very large person. Tom stood again and began pacing, the nervous energy too much for him to contain. I stopped the truck and grabbed my spotlight, one of those high-powered units we use for search and rescue. When I aimed it into the trees, I caught a glimpse of dark fur and massive shoulders disappearing behind a cluster of old-growth firs. But I also saw something else, something that made my blood run cold. What? Intelligence. Purpose, whatever this thing was. It wasn't just wandering through the forest. It was moving with the kind of deliberate intent that you only see in higher predators. And it was moving parallel to the road, keeping pace with my truck. The implications of that statement settled over me like a chill. If something was intentionally following the service road, matching the speed of a vehicle, it suggested a level of cognitive ability that was deeply unsettling. I should have turned around right then, Tom continued. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there, but I was young and stupid and convinced that I was dealing with a bear that would eventually lose interest and wander off. So I continued toward the research station. He moved to another window, checking the darkness beyond as if he expected something to be watching us. The service road curves sharply about a quarter-mile before the station, following the natural contours of the ridge. As I came around that curve, my headlights swept across the clearing where the research station sits, and there it was. Tom's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, standing directly in front of the building, not hiding in the shadows, not crouched behind cover, standing in the open like it owned the place, like it had been waiting for me. How big was it? Massive. Had to be 8, maybe 9 feet tall, with shoulders that were easily 3 feet across. Covered in dark hair, not fur like a bear, but hair. Coarse, thick hair that hung in matted clumps. But it was the posture that got to me. Completely upright, arms hanging at its sides, head tilted slightly as if it was studying my truck. Tom returned to his chair but couldn't seem to sit still. His description matched the hiker's account almost perfectly, down to the smallest details. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, engine running, headlights illuminating this thing like it was performing on a stage, and it just stared back at me, didn't move, didn't react to the lights or the sound of the engine, just watched. Could you see its face? Tom closed his eyes, and I could see him forcing himself to remember details he'd probably spent years trying to forget. That's when everything changed, he said. I grabbed my flashlight and added its beam to the headlights, trying to get a better look. And when that extra light hit its face, he opened his eyes and looked directly at me. It was humanoid, but wrong in every conceivable way. The basic structure was there, 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, but the proportions were all off. The brow ridge was massive, protruding like a shelf over eyes that were too large and too dark. The nose was flattened, more like a gorilla's than a human's. And the mouth. Tom shuddered. When it saw the flashlight beam hit its face, it opened its mouth. Not in aggression or threat, but almost like it was smiling, showing me teeth that were too long, too sharp, too numerous. And that's when I saw the intelligence behind those eyes. What do you mean? It wasn't just looking at me. It was studying me, evaluating me, making some kind of assessment about who I was and what I represented. And in that moment, I understood with absolute clarity that I was not dealing with an animal. I was facing something that possessed a level of consciousness and cognitive ability that shouldn't exist. The room fell silent except for the sound of wind in the trees outside. I found myself thinking about the Native American legends that warned of dangerous beings living within the depths of Crater Lake. Creatures that served as guardians between this world and something far more sinister. How long did you stare at each other? I asked. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few more seconds. Then, without any warning, it took a step toward my truck, and that's when I finally understood the true magnitude of what I was dealing with. Tom's voice became even quieter, forcing me to lean forward to hear him. Each step it took covered an enormous amount of ground. Not running, not hurrying, just walking with a stride length that defied belief. And as it approached, I could see more details that my mind really didn't want to process, such as the arms were too long, hanging down past where its knees should have been. The hands. Tom paused and took a shaky breath. The hands were almost human, but larger and tipped with claws that caught the light from my headlights. Dark claws, maybe 4 inches long, that looked like they could tear through steel. What did you do? What any sane person would do. I threw the truck in reverse and got the hell out of there. But as I was backing up, trying to turn around in that narrow clearing, I made the mistake of looking in my side mirror. Tom stood and walked to the window again, as if the act of looking outside could somehow verify that we were safe in the present moment. It had followed me. Not running, not charging, just walking with that same measured pace. And it was smiling again, like it was enjoying my fear, like this was all some kind of game to it. Did it pursue you once you got turned around? That's the strangest part. Once I got the truck pointed back toward the main road and started driving away, it just stopped. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see it chasing after me, but it had simply returned to its position in front of the research station, like a guard returning to his post. Tom came back to the table and finished his whiskey in one gulp. I drove straight back to the ranger station and sat in the parking lot for about an hour, trying to process what I'd just experienced. trying to convince myself that it had been a bear, or a trick of the light, or anything other than what I knew it actually was. But you couldn't convince yourself, no. Because of what happened next, what it did to me. Tom looked directly into my eyes, and I saw a depth of exhaustion that went far beyond physical fatigue. When that thing looked at me, when our eyes met across that clearing, it wasn't just seeing me, it was seeing into me, reading me, learning something about who I am at the most fundamental level. What do you mean? I mean that for the rest of my life I've felt connected to it. Not in some mystical or supernatural way, but like it marked me. Like it decided that I was someone it needed to keep track of. And ever since that night I've felt its presence in these mountains, watching, waiting, making sure I remember our encounter. The implications of Tom's statement sent a chill down my spine. If he was right, if something that intelligent and powerful had taken a personal interest in him, then his years of night patrol work took on an entirely different meaning. Tom, I said carefully, are you saying you think it's still out there? Still watching you? He nodded slowly. I know it is, because I've seen it again, not up close like that first time, but glimpses. Shadows moving through the forest during my patrols, shapes that disappear when I try to focus on them. And sometimes, he paused, sometimes I hear it calling. Calling? Not words, not language as we understand it, but sounds that seem to carry meaning, like it's trying to communicate, like it wants me to come back to that clearing, back to where we first met. Tom's confession hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. The rational part of my mind wanted to dismiss his account as the product of stress, isolation, and 21 years of psychological pressure. But the professional part of my mind, the part trained to evaluate evidence and assess credible threats, couldn't ignore the consistency of his story with other reports we'd received over the years. What do you think it wants? I asked. Tom smiled sadly. I think it wants me to understand that these mountains belong to it, that we're just temporary visitors in its domain. And I think, he hesitated, I think it's been waiting for the right moment to deliver that message more clearly. As if summoned by his words, a sound echoed through the forest outside, a low, resonant call that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Tom and I both froze, listening as the sound repeated twice more before fading into the night. That, Tom whispered, is why I take the night shifts. The sound outside Tom's cabin that night changed everything between us. Not just because it validated his account of the encounter, but because it meant that whatever he'd faced in the year 2000 was still active, still present, and still paying attention to human activity in the park. The next morning, I made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just days earlier. I requested access to all incident reports filed at Crater Lake National Park over the past 25 years, particularly those involving unexplained sightings, missing persons, and unusual animal encounters. If Tom's experience was part of a larger pattern, I needed to understand the scope of what we were dealing with. What I found in the archives was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Crater Lake had indeed been a hotspot for unexplained phenomena for decades. The reports followed certain patterns that, once I began looking for them, were impossible to ignore. Sightings clustered around the remote areas of the park, particularly the backcountry regions accessible only by service roads or hiking trails. They occurred most frequently during the shoulder seasons, late fall and early spring, when tourist traffic was minimal and the weather conditions were harsh. But most significantly, they showed a marked increase in both frequency and detail starting in the year 2000. The year of Tom's encounter. I spread the reports across my desk and began creating a timeline. 3 weeks after Tom's initial sighting, a backpacking group reported being stalked by something large while camping near the Pacific Crest Trail Junction. 2 months later, a maintenance worker described hearing human-like vocalizations coming from the forest while repairing trail markers in the same general area where Tom had his encounter. The pattern continued year after year. Hikers reporting the feeling of being watched. Campers describing heavy footsteps circling their sites during the night. Park employees finding unusually large footprints in soft soil, always in areas where Tom conducted his regular patrols. But the most compelling evidence came from an unexpected source. Hidden among the routine incident reports was a series of internal memos exchanged between park supervisors and regional wildlife biologists starting in 2001. The correspondence revealed that park management had been quietly investigating reports of an unknown large mammal for years, but had deliberately kept the investigation low profile to avoid media attention and potential panic among visitors. The memos included detailed photographs of tracks, hair samples, and even audio recordings of vocalizations that didn't match any known species in the region. Wildlife experts from Oregon State University had been consulted confidentially, and their conclusions were unambiguous. The evidence suggested the presence of an unknown primate species, significantly larger than any documented North American fauna. More troubling were the behavioral assessments included in the files. Unlike typical wildlife encounters where animals generally avoided human contact, this creature seemed to be actively monitoring human activity in specific areas of the park. Trail cameras had captured fleeting images of a large, bipedal figure, always at the periphery of the frame, always seemingly aware of the camera's presence. It demonstrates what can only be described as surveillance behavior, read one report from 2005. The subject appears to be conducting systematic observation of human activity patterns, particularly those of park staff conducting routine maintenance and patrol duties. I called Tom into my office to review the evidence. As he read through the reports and studied the photographs, I watched his face cycle through a range of emotions: relief at finally having his experience validated, concern about the implications of what we'd discovered, and something else that took me a moment to identify: fear. Not for himself, but for what might happen if this information became public. They've been covering it up, he said finally. Not covering up. Managing, containing. There's a difference. Tom looked at me sharply. Is there? These reports go back decades. How many people have encountered this thing? How many have been too scared or embarrassed to report it officially? It was a valid question. For every incident that made it into the official files, there were probably dozens more that went unreported. The stigma associated with cryptid sightings, combined with the natural reluctance to report something that sounded impossible, meant we were likely seeing only a fraction of the actual encounters. Look at this, Tom said, pointing to a photo dated 6 months earlier. It showed a series of footprints in snow, each one measuring nearly 18 inches long and showing clear impressions of 5 distinct toes. This was taken less than a mile from where I saw it that first night. The footprints were remarkable not just for their size, but for their clarity and the depth of impression they'd left in the snow. Whatever had made them weighed significantly more than a human being, and the stride length suggested a creature of enormous proportions. Tom, I said carefully, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. He looked up from the reports. In all the years since your encounter, through all the night patrols and all the times you felt its presence, have you ever tried to make contact? Have you ever gone back to that clearing deliberately? Tom was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him wrestling with whether to tell me the truth. Yes, he said finally, several times, and it was always there, waiting, like it knew I would come. Tom's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. The last time was about 6 months ago. I drove out to the research station around midnight, same route as that first night. But this time I got out of the truck. I felt my blood run cold. Tom, that was incredibly dangerous. I know, but I needed to understand what it wanted from me. 20 years of feeling watched, of knowing something was out there keeping track of my movements. I couldn't live with that uncertainty anymore. What happened? Tom stood and walked to the window overlooking the park's main road. A few early tourists were already arriving for the day, unaware of the conversation taking place just a few hundred yards from their peaceful nature experience. It came out of the trees the moment I stepped away from the truck, not aggressive, not threatening, just curious. It approached to within maybe 20 feet and stopped, and we looked at each other again just like that first night. Could you see it clearly, clearer than I wanted to? It had aged. There were streaks of gray in the dark hair, and the face showed lines that hadn't been there before. But the eyes, Tom turned back to me. The eyes were exactly the same. Still intelligent, still aware, still somehow sad. Sad? That's the only way I can describe it. Like it was lonely, like it had been waiting all these years for someone to acknowledge its existence, to treat it as something more than a monster hiding in the woods. Tom returned to his chair and pulled out a small digital recorder. I recorded our encounter, he said, setting the device on my desk. I'm not sure why. Maybe I thought no one would believe me without proof. Maybe I just wanted to document what might be the most significant zoological discovery in modern history. He pressed play, and the recording began with the ambient sounds of the forest at night, wind in the trees, the distant call of an owl, the soft hum of insects. But after about 30 seconds, a new sound emerged. a series of low, resonant vocalizations that seemed to carry emotional weight far beyond simple animal communication. The sounds were hauntingly melodic, rising and falling in patterns that suggested language, or at least complex emotional expression. But what struck me most was the way they seemed to echo in the recording, as if the creature possessed a vocal range and resonance that exceeded normal biological parameters. It was trying to communicate, Tom said as the recording continued. Not just making noise or trying to intimidate me. It was actually attempting some form of dialogue. Did you respond? I tried. I spoke to it, quietly, calmly, the way you might approach any wild animal, and it listened, really listened. When I stopped talking, it would respond with more vocalizations. We went back and forth like that for maybe 10 minutes. The recording captured exactly what Tom described, an exchange between human and something else that demonstrated unmistakable intelligence and intent. Whatever this creature was, it possessed cognitive abilities that placed it far beyond any known animal species. How did the encounter end? I asked. It just walked away, turned around and disappeared back into the forest. But before it left, it did something that I'll never forget. Tom paused the recording and looked directly at me. It pointed. Deliberately, clearly, unmistakably pointed toward the deeper forest. Like it was inviting me to follow. Like it wanted to show me something. Did you follow? No. I'm not that brave or that stupid. But I've thought about it every day since. What if it was trying to share something important? What if there are others like it out there? What if this whole area is home to a population of these creatures that we've never acknowledged or studied? The implications of Tom's questions were staggering. If even one creature like this existed, it would revolutionize our understanding of primate evolution and North American ecosystems. If there were multiple individuals, if there was an entire population living undiscovered in the remote corners of Crater Lake National Park, then we were looking at potentially the most significant biological discovery in human history. But we were also looking at a management nightmare of unprecedented proportions. Tom, I said, I think we need to involve someone with more expertise than either of us possesses. Someone who can help us understand what we're dealing with and how to proceed responsibly. You mean go public? I mean proceed carefully. Crater Lake is already known for mysterious disappearances and unexplained phenomena. If word gets out that there's credible evidence of an unknown primate species living in the park, we'll have every cryptozoologist, thrill seeker, and media outlet in the country descending on us. That could be dangerous for both the creatures and the public. Tom nodded slowly. So what do you suggest? Before I could answer, my radio crackled to life with an urgent message from Park Dispatch. Another hiker had gone missing, this time in the exact area where Tom had been conducting his encounters with the creature. The search and rescue operation was being organized and all available personnel were being called in to assist. As Tom and I gathered our gear and prepared to head out, I couldn't shake the feeling that this disappearance wasn't random. If the creature had been trying to communicate with Tom, if it had been attempting to establish some form of contact with human beings, then maybe its patience had finally run out. Maybe it had decided to take a more direct approach. The missing hiker was Dr. Sarah Chen, a primatologist from Portland State University who had been studying behavioral patterns in Oregon's wildlife populations. According to her research permit, she'd been conducting observational studies in the remote backcountry areas of Crater Lake for the past 3 weeks. Her last known location was the trail junction near Lau Rock, less than a mile from the research station where Tom had first encountered the creature. This was not a coincidence. As we organized the search teams, Tom pulled me aside with a grim expression. She was looking for it, he said quietly. Dr. Chen, she contacted me about 2 months ago, asking questions about unusual wildlife sightings in the park. I thought she was just another academic chasing cryptid stories, so I didn't tell her anything. You think she found evidence of the creature on her own? I think she found something that led her to the right area, and I think she got too close. The implications were chilling. If a trained primatologist had been studying the creature and had subsequently disappeared, it suggested either that her research had taken her into dangerous territory, or that the creature had decided to actively intervene in human attempts to study it. We deployed 3 search teams across the area where Dr. Chen had last been seen. Tom and I took the route that led toward the abandoned research station, following the same path he'd driven that night in 2000. But this time we were on foot, moving through terrain that seemed somehow more hostile and unwelcoming than I'd ever experienced it. The forests of mountain hemlock and Shasta red fir closed in around us as we followed the trail, their branches heavy with new snow that muffled sound and created an oppressive sense of isolation. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. Every sound suggested something large moving just beyond our line of sight. We'd been searching for about 2 hours when we found Dr. Chen's backpack. It was sitting in the middle of a small clearing, positioned so deliberately that it was clearly meant to be found. The pack hadn't been torn or damaged. It had been carefully placed, almost like an offering or a message. Tom approached it cautiously while I maintained watch on the tree line around us. "Her research notes are still here," Tom said, rifling through the contents. "Camera, recording equipment, sample containers, everything you'd expect a field researcher to carry." "Any indication of what she found?" Tom pulled out a waterproof notebook and began reading Dr. Chen's most recent entries. His face grew increasingly grave as he progressed through her observations. "Listen to this," he said. "Day 18 of observation. Subject demonstrates consistent territorial behavior around abandoned research facility. Vocalizations recorded indicate sophisticated communication system beyond current primate classification. Evidence suggests possible family group structure with multiple individuals." Multiple individuals. The creature Tom had been encountering for 21 years wasn't a solitary anomaly. There was a population of them living in the remote corners of Crater Lake National Park. "There's more," Tom continued. Day 20. Attempted direct observation from concealed position near research station. Subject aware of surveillance but tolerated presence. Clear evidence of tool use and environmental modification. Intelligence assessment. Comparable to great apes, possibly higher. Recommendation: immediate contact with cryptozoological research community. Dr. Chen had been planning to go public with her findings. She'd documented evidence of an unknown primate species and was preparing to share her research with the academic community. And then she disappeared. "Tom," I said slowly, "where exactly are we right now?" He looked around, getting his bearings from the surrounding landmarks. "About a quarter-mile from the research station. We're on the same route I took that first night." "And you said the creature always seemed to know when you were coming, like it was monitoring your approach." Tom nodded, understanding immediately where my thoughts were leading. "You think it knows we're here now?" Before I could answer, we heard it. A low, resonant call echoing through the forest from somewhere ahead of us. The same sound Tom had recorded during his encounter 6 months earlier, but louder, more insistent, somehow more urgent. "It's calling to us," Tom said. Just like Dr. Chen described in her notes. We had a choice to make. We could radio for backup, retreat to safety, and wait for reinforcements before proceeding. Or we could follow the sound toward what was almost certainly a direct encounter with the creature that had been shaping Tom's life for the past 2 decades. "We need to find Dr. Chen," I said. Tom checked his radio and service weapon, then looked toward the direction the call had come from. Together, we moved through the forest with the careful deliberation of soldiers entering hostile territory. Every step was measured, every sound evaluated for potential threat. The calls continued to echo around us, seeming to come from multiple directions, suggesting that we were being guided along a specific route. After 20 minutes of careful progress, we emerged into the clearing where the research station sat. And there, standing exactly where Tom had first seen it 21 years earlier, was the creature. But this time it wasn't alone. 2 smaller figures flanked it on either side, still massive by human standards but clearly younger, possibly offspring. And sitting on the ground between them, very much alive but obviously shaken, was Dr. Chen. The adult creature, the same one Tom had been encountering all these years, stepped forward slightly when it saw us emerge from the tree line. But instead of the aggressive posture we might have expected, it raised one massive hand in what could only be interpreted as a greeting. "Dr. Chen," I called out carefully. "Are you injured?" She looked toward us with wide eyes but shook her head. "I'm okay," she called back, "but I think they want to talk." The adult creature gestured toward Dr. Chen, then toward us, then toward itself. The meaning was unmistakable. It wanted to facilitate some form of communication between the human researchers and its family group. Tom stepped forward slowly, his hands visible and empty. "You remember me," he said to the creature. The massive head nodded once, distinctly and deliberately. "You've been watching me all these years, waiting for me to come back." Another nod. "And now you've brought Dr. Chen here because she understands what you are, what you represent." The creature gestured toward Dr. Chen again, then toward the abandoned research station behind it. Following its indication, I noticed for the first time that the building had been modified. Windows that had been boarded up for years were now clear, and there were signs of recent habitation around the structure. "They've been living here," Dr. Chen said, her voice filled with wonder and professional excitement. using the research station as shelter. They've been here for decades, possibly longer. A stable family group that's managed to remain hidden from human detection. Until now, Tom said. The adult creature made a series of vocalizations, complex melodic sounds that carried emotional undertones of sadness and resignation. It gestured toward the forest around us, then toward the three humans in the clearing. Dr. Chen translated softly. I think it's saying that hiding is no longer possible, that too many people are coming into their territory, that they need to find a new arrangement with our species. The implications of what we were witnessing began to sink in. This wasn't just a cryptozoological discovery. It was first contact with what was essentially a separate intelligent species that had been sharing our world in secret for generations. These creatures possessed language, tool use, family structures, and territorial awareness. They had been observing human activity for decades, learning our patterns, understanding our behaviors, and now they were ready to make themselves known. What do they want from us? I asked. The adult creature gestured toward Tom specifically, then toward itself, then toward the research station. The meaning was clear. It wanted Tom to approach, to engage in direct communication. Tom looked at me, and I saw 21 years of curiosity, fear, and wonder warring in his expression. This is what it's been waiting for, he said. All this time, all these encounters, it was building up to this moment. He walked slowly across the clearing, stopping about 10 feet from the creature. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the park ranger who had dedicated his life to protecting this place, and the intelligent being that had been its secret guardian for generations. Then the creature did something that changed everything. It reached behind itself and produced an object that it held out toward Tom. A carved piece of wood. Intricate and beautiful, clearly the product of sophisticated tool use and artistic ability. Tom accepted the gift with obvious reverence, examining the craftsmanship with professional appreciation. It's beautiful, he said. Thank you. The creature nodded once more, then gestured toward the forest beyond the clearing. The message was unmistakable. It was time for them to leave, to find a new home away from the increasing human presence in their traditional territory. Wait, Dr. Chen called out, rising to her feet. Please, we need to understand. We need to document this properly. The scientific community, the government, they need to know that you exist. The adult creature looked at her for a long moment, then shook its massive head. It gestured toward the sky, toward the world beyond the forest, and made a series of vocalizations that sounded distinctly negative. They don't want to be studied, Tom said, understanding instinctively. They don't want to become specimens or curiosities. They just want to live in peace. The creature nodded again, then began walking toward the tree line. The two younger individuals followed, moving with the same fluid grace that had characterized their elder. But before disappearing into the forest, the adult turned back one last time. It looked directly at Tom and made a single, soft vocalization that sounded unmistakably like gratitude. Then it was gone, vanishing into the ancient forest that had sheltered its kind for generations. We stood in the clearing for several minutes after they disappeared, processing what we had just experienced. Dr. Chen was frantically scribbling notes in her field journal, trying to capture every detail of the encounter. Tom was examining the carved artifact they had left behind, running his fingers over the intricate patterns with obvious emotion. They're leaving, he said finally. After all these years, they're finally leaving. Where will they go? Dr. Chen asked. Tom looked toward the deeper wilderness beyond the park boundaries, toward the vast expanses of undeveloped forest that still existed in the remote corners of the Cascade Range. Somewhere we'll never find them. Somewhere they can continue to exist without interference from our world. As we made our way back through the forest toward the search teams, I found myself thinking about the implications of what we'd witnessed. We had documented evidence of an intelligent species that had been sharing our world in secret. Creatures that possessed cognitive abilities and cultural structures that challenged our understanding of evolution and consciousness. But we also had a responsibility to honor their clearly expressed desire for privacy and autonomy. What do we tell the search teams about Dr. Chen? I asked Tom. The truth, Dr. Chen answered before Tom could respond. That I got lost, that I spent a cold night in the forest, and that I was found safe and unharmed. And your research? Your documentation of their existence. Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment, weighing the implications of her decision. Some discoveries are too important to publicize, she said finally. Some secrets are meant to be kept. That evening, as we filed our reports and briefed the search and rescue teams on Dr. Chen's successful recovery, Tom and I sat in his cabin one more time. The carved artifact sat on his kitchen table between us. tangible proof of our encounter with something extraordinary. "Do you think we made the right choice?" I asked. Tom smiled for the first time since I'd known him. Not the strained expression of someone carrying a terrible secret, but the genuine smile of someone who had finally found peace. "I think we honored their wishes," he said, "and I think that's all any of us can ask for." Outside, the forest of Crater Lake National Park settled into its familiar rhythms of wind and wildlife. But somewhere in those ancient trees, a family of remarkable beings was beginning a new chapter of their existence, carrying with them the knowledge that at least a few humans were capable of respecting their right to remain hidden. Tom never worked another night shift after that encounter. He didn't need to anymore. His 21-year vigil was finally over, and the creatures he had been unconsciously protecting were safe in their anonymity. The park returned to its normal patterns of operation, and the official records would show nothing more than a routine missing person case resolved successfully. But sometimes, late at night when the moon is dark and the forest is particularly quiet, rangers still report hearing distant calls echoing through the mountains around Crater Lake. Calls that seem to carry messages of gratitude from the hidden guardians of the wilderness, acknowledging the humans who chose to keep their secrets safe. And in Tom's cabin, the carved artifact serves as a reminder that this world still holds mysteries worth protecting, and that the greatest discoveries are sometimes the ones we choose never to share. My grandfather always said the mountains remember everything, every footstep, every breath, every death. Standing at the edge of Cataloochee Valley as dawn broke over the Great Smoky Mountains, I understood what he meant. The mist rising from the hollers carried whispers that only someone with Cherokee blood could truly hear. "My name is Wahali Amadahi, and like my ancestors before me, I am a guardian of these ancient woods. Not the kind of guardian the old stories speak of, the ones who could speak to animals and shapeshift under the moon, but a modern one, a park ranger for the National Park Service, carrying a radio instead of a war club, wearing government-issued khaki instead of traditional dress. Still, the responsibility feels the same. These mountains are in my blood, passed down through my mother's line from the Wolf clan, and I protect them with everything I have." That October morning started like any other. I'd been patrolling the backcountry trails for 6 years, ever since I'd returned home from college with a degree in forestry, and a head full of scientific explanations for things my grandmother swore were magic. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent 4 years learning to measure trees and catalog species, only to come back to a place where the trees themselves were my teachers. The radio crackled to life as I checked the overnight weather station readings. "Wahali, you copy?" "Copy, dispatch." "What have you got?" "Missing persons report came in about 20 minutes ago. Family of 4 didn't return from yesterday's day hike on the Rough Fork Trail. Vehicles still in the parking area. You're closest to that sector." I felt my stomach tighten. Missing persons cases were the worst part of the job. In these mountains, you could step off a trail and disappear forever. The terrain was unforgiving, steep ravines, hidden caves, and dense rhododendron thickets that could swallow a person whole. And then there were the other things, the ones we didn't put in the official reports. "Copy that. ETA 20 minutes to the trailhead. Can you give me details on the missing party?" "The Hendersons from Atlanta. Parents Mark and Linda. Kids Jessica and Tommy, ages 10 and 7. Last seen yesterday around 3 p.m. starting the Rough Fork Trail loop. Supposed to be back by 6 p.m. My chest constricted. Kids. It was always harder when kids were involved. I reached the Rough Fork trailhead as the morning sun began burning off the mist. The Hendersons' red SUV sat alone in the gravel lot, a child's forgotten sweater visible through the rear window. I checked my gear, emergency medical kit, water, rope, GPS unit, and my grandfather's traditional hunting knife that I carried for reasons I couldn't entirely explain to my supervisors. The trail started easy enough, following an old logging road through second-growth forest. But I knew where it led, deep into one of the most remote sections of the park, where the tourist maps marked areas as primitive wilderness, and the ranger maps had notations in red ink warning of unstable terrain and seasonal trail closures. About a mile in, I found their first sign. A granola bar wrapper caught on a blackberry bush, just off the main trail. Then, 50 yards further, tiny sneaker prints in the mud beside a creek crossing. They'd definitely come this way, but something was wrong. The prints showed they'd left the marked trail. I keyed my radio. "Dispatch, I've got sign of the missing party about a mile up Rough Fork Trail. Looks like they went off trail near marker 12. Continuing pursuit." "Copy, Wahali. SAR team is mobilizing but won't reach you for at least an hour. Keep us posted. Following the tracks led me into territory I knew well but rarely ventured into alone. This was the deep forest, where the Cherokee had once hunted and held ceremonies, where my grandmother said the spirits still walked. The trees here were old, massive tulip poplars and hemlocks that had somehow escaped the loggers' saws a century ago. Their canopy was so thick that even at midday it felt like twilight. The family's trail was easy to follow at first. Broken twigs, disturbed leaves, the occasional piece of litter that made my ranger's heart cringe. But after about a half-mile, something changed. The signs became scattered, confused. It looked like they'd started running. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling call echoing through the trees. Not quite a howl, not quite a roar, but something in between. Something that made every instinct inherited from my hunting ancestors scream danger. I'd heard every animal sound these mountains could produce. Black bear, coyote, even the occasional elk that wandered down from Virginia. This was none of those. I froze, listening. The forest had gone completely silent. No bird calls, no insect buzz, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Even the wind had stilled. In Cherokee tradition, we call this gano-leavsgi, the silence that comes when the spirits are walking. The call came again, closer this time, and I caught something that made my blood run cold. Underneath that inhuman sound was something else, a child's voice, high and terrified, crying for help. I broke into a run, crashing through laurel thickets and leaping fallen logs, following the sound. My radio bounced against my hip, but I didn't dare stop to call for backup. Those kids needed help now. The terrain grew rougher, ascending toward a ridge I'd only explored once before during my first year as a ranger. According to the geological surveys, there were several small caves and rock shelters in that area, places where a family might take shelter, or where something else might take them. I paused at the base of a massive oak tree to catch my breath and check my GPS. The signal was weak this deep in the mountains, but I could see I was still roughly following Rough Fork, which meant I was heading toward Cataloochee Divide. That's when I saw the footprint. It was pressed deep into the soft earth beside a seasonal stream, filled with muddy water from the previous night's rain. But it wasn't a human footprint. It was easily twice the size of my own boot, with what looked like 5 distinct toe impressions. The depth suggested something incredibly heavy, and the stride length, based on the next print I found 20 feet away, indicated something with legs much longer than any human. My grandmother had told me stories when I was young, stories about the Keklakudla, the hair-covered giant who lived in the deepest parts of the forest. I'd dismissed them as folklore, the kind of tales every culture tells about the wilderness beyond their villages. But staring at that impossible footprint, I felt the weight of generations of Cherokee wisdom pressing down on me. The child's cry came again, definitely closer now, and I forced myself to move. Folklore or not, there were real people in danger somewhere ahead of me. I climbed the ridge, using game trails and following what appeared to be a path of disturbed vegetation. The massive footprints appeared regularly now, always heading in the same direction, toward a series of limestone bluffs I could see through the trees ahead. As I approached the bluffs, I caught a scent that made me gag. A mixture of wet fur, decay, and something else, something musky and wild that I couldn't identify. It was the smell of something that had never been civilized, never been tamed. That's when I saw them. The Henderson family was huddled together in a shallow cave beneath one of the bluffs, the parents shielding their children with their bodies. They were alive but terrified, clothes torn and dirty. Linda Henderson clutching a makeshift bandage around her husband's arm. But they weren't alone. Standing at the mouth of the cave, its back to me, was something that challenged every rational thought I'd ever had. It stood at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair that seemed to ripple in the breeze. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, and its arms hung down past where its knees should be. Even from behind I could see the raw power in its frame, muscles moving beneath the fur like steel cables. The creature, and I knew now that's what it was despite everything my education told me about the impossibility, was making low, rumbling sounds. Not threatening exactly, but not reassuring either. It reminded me of the sounds my grandmother used to make when she was trying to calm a frightened animal. Little Tommy Henderson was the first to see me. His eyes went wide over his mother's shoulder, and he started to point. I pressed my finger to my lips, hoping he'd understand the need for quiet, but the creature heard him anyway. It turned slowly, and for the first time in my life, I looked into the eyes of something that shouldn't exist. They were dark, almost black, but undeniably intelligent. There was something ancient in that gaze, something that reminded me of my grandfather's eyes when he spoke about the old ways. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, could taste copper fear in my mouth. Every instinct told me to run, but I couldn't leave the family. The creature took a step toward me, and I saw its face clearly for the first time. It was definitely humanoid, but wilder, more primitive. Its features were heavy and pronounced, covered in the same dark fur as the rest of its body. But the eyes held an intelligence that was deeply unsettling. I remembered something my grandmother once told me. When you meet something in the forest that you don't understand, show respect. The old spirits remember the time when all beings spoke the same language. Moving slowly, I took off my ranger hat and placed it over my heart, the way my grandfather had taught me to show respect to elders. I spoke in Cherokee, words my grandmother had made me memorize even though I didn't always understand their deeper meaning. Osio edohi, dohi et silvi quodi. Hello, cousin, we come in peace. The creature's massive head tilted slightly, and I could have sworn I saw something like recognition in those dark eyes. It made a sound, lower, softer than before, that almost sounded like a response. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it melted back into the forest. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, leaving only the scent of wild fur and the sound of branches settling back into place. I rushed to the Henderson family, who were staring at me like I'd just performed a miracle. Everyone okay? Anyone seriously hurt? Mark Henderson tried to stand but winced and stayed seated. My arm, I think it's broken. But that thing, it didn't hurt us. It's been watching us since yesterday evening, like it was protecting us from something. Protecting you? Linda Henderson nodded, tears streaming down her face. We got lost, took a wrong turn somewhere. When it got dark, we heard things in the forest, scary things, but whenever those sounds got close, that creature would make noise and they'd go away. Young Jessica spoke up in a whisper. The fuzzy man brought us water and berries. I looked around the cave and saw they were right. Something, had brought them food and water. There were fresh mountain laurel leaves arranged like cups, still damp with spring water, and a pile of late-season blackberries. As I radioed for the SAR team and medical evacuation, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd just experienced something beyond the normal world. The Henderson family had been lost in one of the most dangerous parts of the park, in an area where people had disappeared permanently before. But instead of becoming victims, they'd been protected by something that my rational mind insisted couldn't exist. The evacuation went smoothly. The SAR team arrived within the hour, and we had the family back to civilization by late afternoon. Mark Henderson's arm was indeed broken, but otherwise they were all in remarkably good condition for having spent a night exposed in the wilderness. That evening, I sat on my grandmother's porch, watching the sun set over the mountains she'd known all her life. I told her about what had happened, expecting her to either dismiss it as stress-induced hallucination or lecture me about respecting the old spirits. Instead, she just nodded. The Kekla Kudle has been watching over our people for longer than the white man has been on this continent, she said quietly. Your grandfather saw one once, during the hard winter of 1962. It led him to shelter when he was lost in a blizzard. But grandmother, it doesn't make scientific sense. There's no evidence of any large primate species in North America outside of human beings. She smiled and patted my hand with fingers gnarled by arthritis but still strong. Science is just one way of understanding the world, Agidota. Our people have other ways, older ways. Just because something can't be measured doesn't mean it isn't real. That night I lay awake thinking about intelligent eyes and a face covered with fur, about the respectful way the creature had stepped back when I spoke Cherokee, about a family that should have died in the wilderness but was saved by something that officially doesn't exist. Outside my window, the mountains held their secrets close, as they always had. But now I knew I was sharing those secrets with something ancient and powerful, something that had been here long before my people arrived, and would be here long after we were gone. I had no idea that my encounter with the Kekle Kudle was just the beginning. 3 weeks passed before the second disappearance. 3 weeks of routine patrols, filing reports that carefully omitted certain details, and trying to convince myself that what I'd experienced in that limestone cave had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. The scientific part of my mind, the part trained in forestry and wildlife management, worked overtime to rationalize what had happened. But late at night, when the mountain wind whispered through the pines outside my cabin, I remembered those ancient eyes, and I knew, in the part of me that carried my grandmother's blood and my grandfather's stories, that every word of my report had been true. The call came at 4:30 a.m. on a Tuesday in early November. Wahali, we've got another missing persons case. This one's different. I was already reaching for my uniform as dispatch continued the briefing. Something in her voice, Sarah had been working dispatch for 15 years, told me this wasn't a routine lost hiker situation. How different. Two missing parties, separate groups, both experienced hikers. The Martineau couple from Tennessee disappeared somewhere on the Appalachian Trail section through Clingman's Dome. The second group, 3 college students from UNC, was doing a backcountry camping trip near Forney Ridge. Both parties missed their check-in times yesterday. I felt ice settle in my stomach. 2 missing groups in one day was almost unheard of, especially this late in the season when most casual hikers had given up on the mountains until spring. When were they last seen? The Martineaus checked in at the Forney Ridge Trail Junction Sunday afternoon. The college kids, Rebecca Chen, David Martinez, and Alex Thompson, filed their backcountry permit for a 3-day trip starting Monday. Their friends expected them to return to campus yesterday evening. I was already mentally mapping the areas. Clingman's Dome and Forney Ridge weren't far apart, maybe 10 miles of rough mountain terrain. Both areas were in the deep backcountry where cell service was non-existent and the nearest road could be a day's hike away. I'll start with the Martineau Trail. They've been missing longer. Wahali. Sarah's voice dropped. There's something else. We got 3 separate reports from campers in that area yesterday evening. All of them reported hearing strange sounds in the forest. Calling sounds, like someone in distress, but not quite right. The ice in my stomach crystallized. I remembered my grandmother's stories about the Nviya, the spirits that could mimic human voices to lure people into the deep forest. Stories I'd dismissed as folklore until 3 weeks ago. What kind of sounds? Best description we got was from a couple camping at Elkmont. They said it sounded like someone calling for help, but the voice kept changing. Sometimes it was a man, sometimes a woman, sometimes something else. I finished dressing in the dark, my hands moving automatically to check my gear. Standard rescue equipment, plus the things I'd started carrying since my encounter with the Henderson family. My grandfather's bone-handled knife, a pouch of traditional tobacco for offerings, and a small piece of mica my grandmother had pressed into my palm the night I'd told her about the Kekla Kudla. The voice kept changing, she'd said, like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. The drive to Clingman's Dome took 45 minutes on winding mountain roads shrouded in pre-dawn mist. By the time I reached the parking area, the sun was a pale disk struggling through low clouds. The Appalachian Trail stretched away into gray wilderness, ancient and patient. The Martineau's car was a newer Honda Tennessee plates, with 2 expensive mountain bikes locked to a rear rack. I cupped my hands and peered through the windows. Everything looked normal. Water bottles, energy bars, a dog-eared trail guide open to the Smoky Mountain section. I started up the trail at a steady pace, following the white blazes that marked the most famous footpath in America. This section of the AT was rugged but well-maintained, passing through high-elevation forests of spruce and fir that reminded me more of Canada than the southeastern United States. The first sign came 2 miles in. Paul Martineau's hiking pole, expensive carbon fiber, lying beside the trail near a scenic overlook. I picked it up and examined it carefully. No damage, no blood. It looked like it had simply been dropped. I keyed my radio. Dispatch, I've got evidence of the missing hikers at approximately mile marker 2 on the AT south from Clingman's Dome. Continuing search. Copy Wohali. SAR teams are mobilizing but won't reach your location for at least 2 hours due to the remote access. 2 hours. In these mountains, 2 hours could mean the difference between finding someone alive or finding them too late. I pressed on, now following more than just the official trail. There were subtle signs, a scuff mark on a rock, a broken twig pointing the wrong direction that suggested the Martineaus had left the marked path somewhere near the overlook. The forest grew thicker as I descended from the main ridge, following what appeared to be an old game trail through rhododendron thickets and around moss-covered boulders. This was true wilderness, the kind of place where a person could disappear without a trace. That's when I started hearing the voices. At first, I thought it was wind in the trees or maybe the distant sound of other searchers. But as I stopped to listen, the sounds became more distinct. Someone was calling for help, a woman's voice echoing through the forest ahead of me. Help! Please, someone help us! I broke into a jog, crashing through undergrowth and leaping fallen logs. The voice continued, always seeming to come from just ahead, just around the next bend, or over the next rise, but there was something wrong with it. The cadence was off, like someone reading from a script rather than genuine distress. And worse, the voice was too clear. Sound didn't carry that cleanly through dense forest, especially with the dampening effect of the morning mist. I slowed my pace and approached more carefully, every sense on high alert. My grandmother's warnings echoed in my memory. Never follow a voice you can't see, Ugadota. The forest spirits are clever, but they can't always get the details right. The calling continued, now coming from a dense grove of mountain laurel ahead. But as I got closer, I noticed that the birds had gone silent, just like 3 weeks ago, just like when the Kekla Kudla had appeared. I drew my grandfather's knife, not from any belief that a blade could harm a spirit, but because holding it connected me to generations of Cherokee who had walked these mountains and faced their mysteries. The voice changed. Wohali! Wohali, help me! Now it was a man's voice, and it knew my name. I stopped dead. No one else was supposed to be in this area. The SR teams were still hours away, and I hadn't told anyone my specific route. Wohali, please, I'm hurt. The voice was coming from directly ahead, but I could see through the laurel grove. There was no one there. That's when I understood. Something was using my name to try to lure me deeper into the forest, away from any hope of backup or escape. Something that could mimic human voices but didn't quite understand how humans actually spoke. I backed away slowly, knife still drawn, and keyed my radio. Dispatch, I need you to confirm the location of all SAR personnel. All teams are still en route to your location, Wohali. Why? Something's calling my name out here. And it's not human. There was a long pause before Sarah responded. Copy that. Continue your search but maintain extreme caution. Report any other anomalies immediately. The voices stopped abruptly, as if whatever was making them had realized its deception had failed. But the unnatural silence continued, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the rustle of my gear. I circled around the laurel grove, giving it a wide berth, and picked up the Martineau's trail on the far side. Their tracks were clearer here, pressed into the soft earth beside a small stream. But there were other tracks too, the massive 5-toed prints I'd seen 3 weeks ago. My radio crackled. Wohali, we just got another report. Campers near Forney Ridge heard someone calling for help about 30 minutes ago. Voice kept changing between a man and a woman. The pieces clicked together. Whatever was out here wasn't just mimicking random voices, it was actively hunting, using the calls to separate people from their groups, to lure them into the deep forest where no one would find them. But why hadn't it taken the Henderson family? Why had they been protected instead of harmed? I followed the stream for another half-mile, the tracks becoming fresher as I went. The Martineaus couldn't be far ahead, but neither could whatever was stalking them. The stream led to a small waterfall cascading into a clear pool surrounded by ancient hemlocks. And there, sitting on a fallen log beside the water, were Paul and Susan Martineau. They were alive, but something was terribly wrong. They sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead with empty expressions. When I called their names, they didn't respond. They didn't even seem to see me. I approached carefully, scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of movement. The massive tracks circled the clearing multiple times but didn't lead away. Paul, Susan, I'm Ranger Amadahi. You're safe now? Susan blinked slowly and turned toward me. Her eyes were unfocused, pupils dilated despite the dim light filtering through the trees. The singing, she whispered. It's so beautiful. Listen to the singing. I strained my ears but heard nothing except the sound of water over stone. Paul spoke without looking at me. We have to stay. It wants us to stay and listen to the singing. This was beyond anything in my training. The Martineaus were physically unharmed but seemed to be in some kind of trance. I'd heard of psychological trauma causing dissociative states, but this felt different, more deliberate. I knelt in front of Susan and looked directly into her eyes. Susan, I need you to listen to my voice. You're in the Smoky Mountains. You've been missing for 2 days. Your family is worried about you. For a moment, her expression cleared. Ranger? How did you? We were just hiking. We stopped for lunch by this pretty waterfall and then her face went blank again. The singing, don't you hear the singing? That's when I heard it too. Not singing exactly, but a low, harmonic sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was barely audible, felt more than heard, but it had an almost hypnotic quality. The longer I listened, the more I wanted to sit down beside the Martineaus and just rest. I forced myself to look away from the waterfall and focus on my breathing. Whatever this was, it was affecting my mind as well as theirs. I grabbed Paul's arm and pulled him to his feet. He was surprisingly light, as if he'd lost weight during his 2 days missing. We're leaving, now. But the singing. There is no singing, I shouted, and for a moment the spell seemed to break. Paul blinked and looked around as if seeing the forest for the first time. Where are we? Susan, what happened to our packs? I looked around and realized their backpacks were nowhere to be seen. No camping gear, no supplies. They'd been sitting in this clearing for 2 days with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The harmonic sound grew louder and I felt that terrible urge to sit down and listen. But beneath it I caught something else. The sound of movement in the forest around us. Multiple creatures moving through the undergrowth, circling our position. I drew my grandfather's knife and pulled out the piece of mica my grandmother had given me. She'd told me it was sacred to our people, used in ceremonies to confuse evil spirits. Godoi envi, gvuhi gesti. I spoke the old words, the ones my grandmother had taught me for protection. Aniske envi degataiusti. The harmonic sound faltered, became discordant. And in that moment of silence, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Children's voices, high and frightened, calling for help from somewhere deeper in the forest. The college students, Rebecca, David, and Alex. But I couldn't leave the Martineaus. In their current state, they'd wander back to the waterfall and sit down to wait for whatever was hunting them to return. I made a decision that went against every principle of wilderness rescue. I grabbed the emergency beacon from my belt and activated it, then clipped it to Paul Martineau's jacket. Listen to me, I told them both, speaking slowly and clearly. Stay together, follow the stream downhill. Don't stop for anything, don't listen to any voices or sounds except mine on the radio. When the SAR team finds you, tell them Ranger Amadahi has gone after the college students. Susan grabbed my arm with surprising strength. Don't go toward the singing. It's beautiful, but it's wrong. It makes you forget who you are. I keyed my radio. Dispatch, I've located the Martineaus at coordinates. I read off my GPS position. They're alive but disoriented. Emergency beacon is active. I'm continuing search for the second missing party. Before Sarah could respond, I was already moving deeper into the forest, following the sound of those terrified young voices. The trees grew larger as I climbed away from the stream, ancient giants that had stood when my ancestors first walked these mountains. Spanish moss hung like tattered curtains from their branches, and the air itself seemed thicker, older. The children's voices continued, always just ahead, always just out of sight. But I'd learned my lesson. I didn't follow them directly. Instead, I paralleled their sound, using every tracking skill my grandfather had taught me to search for physical signs of the missing students. I found their campsite in a small clearing beside a seasonal creek. 3 backpacks arranged in a neat triangle, sleeping bags laid out with military precision, camp stove set up but unused. Everything was too perfect, too organized. It looked like a display in an outdoor equipment store, rather than a real campsite. The college students were nowhere to be seen, but their tracks were everywhere. Panicked footprints leading away from the campsite in 3 different directions, as if they'd run from something in the middle of setting up camp. I chose the clearest trail and followed it through increasingly dense undergrowth. The footprints belonged to someone running in blind panic, stumbling and recovering, crashing through bushes and around trees. The trail led to another clearing, this one dominated by a massive oak tree that must have been standing when the Cherokee first settled in these mountains. And there, carved into its trunk, were symbols I recognized from my grandmother's stories. They weren't Cherokee symbols. They were older, deeper, scratched into the bark by something with claws rather than tools. The scratches formed a rough spiral pattern that seemed to move when I looked at it directly, drawing the eye inward toward some central point that my mind couldn't quite focus on. Below the tree, barely visible in the dim light, was a dark opening in the earth. Not a natural cave, but something that had been dug, or worn, by the passage of large bodies over countless years. The children's voices were coming from below ground. I'd found where the forest spirits, or whatever they really were, made their home. Standing at the edge of that dark opening, I understood that everything was connected. The Henderson family's rescue, the Martineaus' trance-like state, the college students' disappearance. Something ancient lived in these mountains, something that had been here long before humans arrived. And now it was changing its behavior, becoming more aggressive, more dangerous. I thought of my grandmother's words. The old spirits are stirring. Ugadoda. The world is changing too fast, and they don't understand their place in it anymore. Below ground, a young woman screamed, not in fear but in agony. I clipped a fresh emergency beacon to the oak tree and activated it, then spoke into my radio. Dispatch, I've found evidence of the missing students. Uploading GPS coordinates now. Tell the SRR teams to bring cave rescue equipment and I hesitated, knowing how this would sound. Tell them to bring weapons. Then I took my grandfather's knife in one hand, my flashlight in the other, and descended into the darkness where something older than memory was calling my name in a child's voice. The hunt had become personal. The tunnel descended at a steep angle, its walls worn smooth by the passage of countless bodies over what must have been centuries. My flashlight beam revealed scratch marks in the stone, not random gouges but deliberate patterns that reminded me of the Cherokee syllabary my grandmother had taught me. If the syllabary had been written by claws instead of pen. The air grew thick and humid as I descended, carrying scents of earth and decay mixed with something else, something musky and wild that I'd smelled once before at the mouth of the cave where I'd found the Henderson family. 20 feet down, the tunnel opened into a natural cavern large enough to hold a small house. My flashlight revealed smooth limestone walls covered in more of those claw-scratched symbols, patterns that seemed to writhe and shift in the dancing beam of light. And there, huddled against the far wall, were Rebecca Chen, David Martinez, and Alex Thompson. They were alive, but like the Martineaus, something was terribly wrong. They sat in a perfect line, backs against the stone, staring at something in the center of the cavern that my light couldn't quite illuminate. Their breathing was synchronized, rising and falling together as if controlled by some external rhythm. Rebecca? David? Alex? I called softly. None of them responded. I moved closer, keeping my back to the wall and scanning the shadows beyond my flashlight's reach. In the center of the cavern, where the students were staring, was a raised stone platform covered in what looked like offerings. Bones arranged in careful patterns, dried plants I recognized as traditional Cherokee medicine, and stranger things I couldn't identify. Alex turned his head toward me with mechanical precision. His eyes were completely black, pupils dilated so wide that no iris remained visible. "You shouldn't have come here," he said in a voice that wasn't entirely his own. It carried harmonics, overtones that human vocal cords couldn't produce. "This is a sacred place, older than your people, older than memory." I drew my grandfather's knife and held it where Alex could see it. The bone handle gleamed white in the flashlight beam, carved with symbols that matched some of those on the cavern walls. Recognition flickered in those black eyes. "You carry the old blood," the voice said. "You know the proper words. Why do you come with steel and fire instead of gifts and respect?" I understood then. The cave, the offerings, the symbols. This wasn't just a lair, it was a shrine, and whatever inhabited it expected the same reverence that Cherokee holy places commanded. "I've come for my people," I said carefully, speaking both in English and Cherokee. "Anivuya gadohi, nigado nigada." A sound echoed from the deeper darkness beyond the platform, not the harmonic singing I'd heard above ground, but something closer to laughter. Ancient, knowing laughter that held no warmth. "Your people?" The voice came from everywhere at once now, not just from Alex's mouth. "Your people are the ones who came from across the great water, who brought iron and disease and the sound of falling trees. We were here when your ancestors first crossed the ice bridge. We were here when the Cherokee learned to grow corn and build towns. We are older than your oldest stories." Movement in the shadows behind the platform resolved into a shape that challenged every scientific principle I'd ever learned. The creature stepped into my flashlight beam with deliberate slowness, and I understood why the Henderson children had called it the Fuzzy Man. It stood nearly 9 feet tall, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its face was a mixture of human and something else, intelligent eyes set in features that were both ancient and alien. When it opened its mouth, I saw teeth that belonged in no taxonomy textbook, but it was the intelligence in those eyes that truly frightened me. This wasn't some primitive relic. This was something that had been watching, learning, adapting to human presence for countless generations. "You want your people," the creature said. And now I could see that it was speaking through Alex while simultaneously producing its own voice from somewhere deeper in its throat. "But they are happy here. They dream beautiful dreams and hear the songs of the earth. Why would you take them back to your loud, sharp world?" I looked at the 3 students. They were thinner than they should be after only 2 days missing, and their skin had a grayish pallor that spoke of something essential being slowly drained away. "Because it's not your choice to make," I said firmly. "They have families, lives, futures waiting for them." The creature tilted its massive head. "Futures in your dying world. Your people poison the streams and cut the old trees. Your machines make such noise that the animals forget their songs. What kind of future is that?" There was genuine sadness in its voice, and I began to understand something my grandmother had tried to teach me about the old spirits. They weren't evil, they were lost. The world had changed around them so fast that they no longer knew how to exist in it. "The world is changing," I admitted, "but taking people won't stop that. It will only bring more of us into your sacred places, with more machines and more noise. The creature made a sound like wind through ancient trees. Then what would you have us do, fade away like morning mist? Let the last wild places become roads and houses? I thought of my grandmother's words about balance, about the Cherokee concept of Duyak TV, the right relationship between all living things. Share the wild places, I said. Teach us to remember what we've forgotten. But do it willingly, with respect, not by stealing our people. The creature was silent for a long moment, its ancient eyes studying me. Around the cavern I could see other shapes moving in the darkness. Smaller creatures, a whole community of beings that had lived in these mountains since before human memory. You speak like the old ones, it finally said. The Cherokee who knew the proper ways. But how can we trust that your people will listen? How can we trust that they won't bring their iron and fire to cleanse these places of all mystery? I reached into my pocket and pulled out the piece of mica my grandmother had given me, along with the small pouch of traditional tobacco I always carried. Moving slowly, I approached the offering platform and placed both items among the bones and plants already there. Sky hayo dwi, I said, using the old Cherokee words for be blessed. Negada anivwia, the creature's eyes widened. You know the old prayers. My grandmother taught me. She said the spirits of the mountains would need our help someday, just as we would need theirs. I gestured to the 3 students. These young ones, they're not the enemy. They came here to study the forest, to learn about the natural world. Let me take them back and I'll find a way to bring the right people here. People who understand the old ways. The creature moved closer, and I forced myself not to step back. Up close, I could see intelligence in its features that was unsettling in its depth. This being had been watching human civilization develop, had seen empires rise and fall, had witnessed the slow destruction of the wild places it called home. If I release your people, it said slowly, how do I know you'll keep your word? How do I know you won't return with others who carry iron instead of respect? I thought of everything my grandmother had taught me about the Cherokee way, about the importance of Duyuk TV, the balance between all living things, about the responsibility that came with being a bridge between the old world and the new. Because I am an Ejidawagi, I said, using the old Cherokee word for mountain dweller. Because my people and your people have shared these mountains for countless generations. Because the earth itself will hold me to my promise. The creature studied me for another long moment, then made a gesture I didn't understand. The 3 students blinked in unison, and color began returning to their faces. Rebecca shook her head as if waking from a deep dream. What? Where are we? You're safe, I told her. We're leaving now. As I helped the students to their feet, the creature spoke one more time. Remember your promise, Anijidawagi. The old places grow smaller each year. Soon there will be nowhere left for us to sing the earth songs. I'll remember, I promised. The tunnel leading out seemed shorter than it had going down, but by the time we reached the surface, the 3 students were moving under their own power. The fresh mountain air seemed to clear the last of whatever influence had held them. My radio crackled to life as soon as we emerged. Wohali, SAR teams are converging on your location. What's your status? I have all 3 missing students. We're coming out. The debriefing took hours. The students remembered very little. Hiking into the forest, setting up camp, then waking up in the cave with no memory of how they'd gotten there. The Martineaus had similar gaps in their recollection. The official report mentioned possible exposure to unknown biological agents causing temporary disorientation. No mention of creatures, caves, or promises made to beings older than human memory. But that night I called my grandmother. I met them, I told her simply. She was quiet for a long time. And I told her everything. About the creature in the cave, the promise I'd made, the responsibility I'd accepted to be a bridge between 2 worlds. Your grandfather would be proud, she said finally. He always said you carried the old blood strong. The spirits have been waiting for someone like you, someone who could walk in both worlds. But how do I keep my promise? How do I find people who will respect the old places without destroying them? The same way our people always have, she said. One person at a time, one story at a time. You plant seeds of understanding and wait for them to grow. Over the following weeks, I began that work. I reached out to Cherokee elders, to traditional storytellers, to scientists who studied the connection between indigenous knowledge and conservation. Slowly, carefully, I began to build a network of people who might understand what I'd experienced in that cave. But the real change came from an unexpected source. Rebecca Chen contacted me 6 months later. She'd been having dreams, she said, dreams of ancient forests and creatures that sang to the earth. She'd switched her major from business to environmental science and was writing her thesis on the intersection of folklore and ecology. I know this sounds crazy, she told me over coffee in Gatlinburg. But I think what happened to us in the mountains was real, and I think it's important. David Martinez had similar experiences, as did Alex Thompson. All three had been profoundly affected by their time in the cave, even if they couldn't remember the details. They'd become advocates for wilderness preservation, for respecting indigenous knowledge, for listening to voices that had been ignored for too long. The seeds of understanding were beginning to grow. A year after my encounter in the cave, I was leading a small group of Cherokee elders and sympathetic researchers into the deep backcountry. We carried offerings instead of equipment, respect instead of weapons. At the oak tree with the spiral symbols carved into its bark, I called out in Cherokee, Osio, Edohi, Gadohi and V. The response came not from below ground, but from the forest around us. Multiple voices, ancient and knowing, singing in harmonies that predated human civilization. The work of building bridges between worlds had begun. The Kekle Kudle were ready to share their songs again, and humanity, at least some of us, was finally ready to listen. As I stood in that sacred grove, surrounded by beings from two different worlds learning to trust each other again, I understood what my grandmother had meant about carrying the old blood. Some responsibilities are inherited not through genetics, but through the willingness to stand in the spaces between worlds and hold them together. The mountains remembered everything, and now they were ready to teach their lessons to anyone wise enough to listen. The forest had found its voice again, and I was honored to be its translator.